role, victim services, victim advocate, probation, community corrections.
So my name is Jillian Reese, and I'm the Director of Carter County Drug Prevention. It is my pleasure, as always, to introduce you to Becky Haas, who is just quite the innovator in the field of trauma and ACEs, who has a heart for her community and really practices what she preaches in so many ways. There is no one that I enjoy hosting more than Becky, and I hope that this will be beneficial for all of you today. I will ask you all to stay muted. Please use the chat box as you need to, and we will have a break about an hour and a half in. We'll try to do a little mindfulness exercise at that time. You're welcome to stay on with us or to go do anything you need to do during that break. So I will turn it over to Becky Haas. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Jillian. And I was, we have a mutual fan club. I was on a national call yesterday and talking about the great work that you and partnerships have been doing in Carter County for some time now. And it's always a joy to work with you, and great to see so many signed on today, and some names that I recognize and names that I don't, but I'm hopeful that what we're going to present today is going to better equip you for the job that you're doing. So about a month ago, Jillian had me to do a training, and I guess after a lot of good feedback and maybe some others that wanted to participate, she asked me to do sort of a recap, but to stretch it out a little bit. So the training you're going to be part of today is 3.5 hours, but we are going to take a 15-minute break about 90 minutes in, and we're going to cover the key principles of trauma-informed care and developing a trauma-informed approach. This is not a train the trainer series, but I'm going to include some trainer tips, and we're going to wrap it up with some strategies of how to implement this science. Science, okay? So when I say trainer tips, likely those of you that are on this training today are people of influence, whether it's in a school or you're a foster parent or a mentor, a youth mentor, and you're influencing professionals, or you're influencing the lives of children and youth. So we're going to give some tips on ways to share this information today. Okay. Let's see here, hold on. Okay, so as you prepare to do the training, it's always good to think about who do you plan to reach. So whether it's one, if you're a foster parent and you're on here today, or if you're an administrator of a program, it's always good to think about sharing this content. Who are you planning to reach? So what you're going to receive today is really intended for a wide range of potential audiences, including service providers, community partners, foster parents, mentors, and youth themselves. And then prior to sharing this training or parts of it as you move forward, you want to think about the backgrounds of the people that are going to be listening, and their level of experience, their work settings. You know, I've been a trainer much of my career of 40 some years, and many trainings are kind of one size fits all, but this one is not exactly that way, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. And then you want to always leave with new tools. So the work that I do now, I started learning about this topic in 2014, working for a local police department. And then after 2018, the work was recognized by SAMHSA as a national model for cities to follow. Then I was offered a job in healthcare. And then recently this spring, I launched out to be part of a national platform. And I'm so proud of East Tennessee and the work that's been done really now in rural Appalachia, Southwest Virginia as well. And now that I'm involved in national conversations, I really have many opportunities to showcase a lot of the work that's been done here. And where I sort of stand out in this whole conversation is being a practitioner and what to do. So it's kind of like if we were going to be talking about baking today. One of these days, I'd like to take one of those cool cooking classes. But say if I was doing a class on some cooking today, you know, we may have the butter, the flour, the sugar, whatever. But this training, I always like to include in my trainings what to do with it. Okay. All right. So, well, ouch, why am I okay? So, in any training or any time that you're conveying information, hang on a minute. Anytime you're conveying information about this content, it's always paramount that you model trauma-informed practices. So I always start every training I do by saying that if I was the only person in this training today or in the room, you know, I've experienced training, and as we go through this training today, we'll see the universal prevalence of trauma is such that we could pretty much safely say that 80%, 70 to 80% of our team members, oftentimes of our family members, of our neighbors, of our classroom, have all experienced trauma in one form or another. And so we want to be very sensitive in relating this information and do it with some caution. The overarching rule of trauma-informed care is do no harm. And I was in a corporate setting training hundreds of corporate professionals some time back, and found that a material that I included in the training for some time, it actually caused a triggering reaction to one of the team members. And so I actually changed up my training and felt for that audience, maybe that piece of content was really was not appropriate. So what was I doing? I was practicing creating safety. And then you also want to let participants know, or however, what audience you're sharing this with, that if at any time any of the content, you know, they may feel uncomfortable, want to leave the room for a drink of water, or just to stretch their legs, well, the last thing we want to do is talk about domestic violence, or having an addicted caregiver, and someone, you know, is very uncomfortable enduring the training. So we want to again create safety, and then be practical. We're going to help participants see how to use this training, and then don't overcomplicate information, but simplify. And I really feel in part that's the success that we've seen here in rural Appalachia around the embracing of this content has been the fact that we've followed two things: simple and urgent. That we've got this message out, that it's in a simplified fashion, and that it's urgent that we act on it. And then show respect to those that you are sharing this content with by allowing input and ideas. And then most important, professionals, and again, I don't know all the experience levels of everybody on the training today, but self-care. Self-care is so important. If you've flown on a plane sometime, maybe before COVID, right before they took off, the steward or the stewardess said, in the unlikely event of loss of cabin pressure, the oxygen mask will fall from the ceiling of the cabin, and you put your own mask on before you put on that of others. And so professionals, you've got to make self-care a priority. Last week I was in West Virginia training an entire police department, and you know, police have not given enough attention to this topic, and policing is a very difficult profession, and it's certainly one now that's quite under fire for the misconduct of a few officers when there are thousands of good officers. But in 2018 and 19, more officers took their own life than were killed in the line of duty. And so in the law enforcement world, more attention must be given to self-care. And so if you're in a supervisory role today, you need to take you need to take the initiative that the staff that serves under you, that you're having some discussion and conversation around implementing self-care. For me, I'm a bike rider. So this morning at 7 o'clock, I saw the sunrise on the Tweetsie Trail, where every day that the weather's possible, I'm out there trying to get in about 15 miles. And that to me, along with faith, my prayer time, but sometimes I combine it. Matter of fact, today I was going down the road and having a little prayer and had my headphones on, and I realized there were some people in a parking lot, and I thought, oh well. So I was kind of combining the two, but self-care is super important. Okay, so let's jump in here. I'm not sure why my arrows are not advancing. Okay. Okay, so the learning objectives in this first section, we're going to have a shared understanding of trauma, how to identify trauma, and then the effects of trauma on brain development. Whoops, hold on. All right, so a first little video that I'm going to share is by Brene Brown, and it's all about empathy. So as a trauma-informed practitioner, you need to understand the tool and the value of empathy that you bring to your program, okay? So here we go.
No sound.
How's your sister?
There's no sound coming.
Oh. Yeah. I saw a chat, but I couldn't answer it. I'm sorry. You can see it? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Now do you hear sound?
No.
Well. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. All right, let's try it again. Now do you hear it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right. Okay, hold on. All right, so wonderful video, and I'm sure several of you have seen that one many times, maybe even share it yourself. But the reason I like the Brene Brown video is it really paints a good picture of the difference between empathy and sympathy. And one of the wonderful things we know about ACEs is that though it may be fact, it's not fate. And empathy is a key tool that we can use in our toolbox, no matter what your role is, to helping trauma survivors to heal. So what is empathy? And the little video does a great job of sharing illustrating really what empathy is. But empathy is basically perspective taking. It's seeing something from someone else's side. I saw a little graphic earlier today, and there was a large kind of like a rectangle shape, and it said something like, this is somebody's life, and then above it, it had just a tiny fraction of the length of that, and it says, this is how much you know about it. And in other words, many times when somebody's rough around us or maybe short, there are so many other things going on in someone's life, and we have to be careful at times not to take things personal, but empathy is a great tool to have in our tool belt. Many people that I've had the privilege of training over the last 5 years, they all talk about now how that empathy is really a way of life. Trauma-informed is a way of life. And one of the things that drew me to really being someone to communicate this topic and see the importance of it in the educational programs I've been a part of my career, as well as grant writing and grant program management. I've never done anything where I saw adding something to your program improve the outcomes. And so I've had the privilege, this is a 4th year, that Topper Academy in the Johnson City school systems has been using a trauma-informed approach. And when I first began in 2017 with the principal, Miss Ryden Bacon, she came to a training a little similar to the one you're in today. And at the end of it, she asked myself myself and Dr. Clements to if we would train our staff. So we hurried to make an opportunity and a date, and we trained the staff in July. And she asked her staff if they would be willing to give this a 1-year approach, 1 year that they would all agree to move down this road together for the first year. And now into a 4th year, I know that the staff would really not like to ever go back to teaching as usual without understanding trauma informed. And some of the outcomes that we saw was historically attendance in that school was 55%. And within a few weeks of using a trauma informed lens, it jumped up to 90%. And typically about 140 students in that school would earn about 200 credits a year. The first year they earned 1,155, the second year 1,044. Typically out of about 140 students, they would have about 8 graduations. And the first year they had 65 and the second year 44. And so many of the professionals that I've trained locally, regionally, and nationwide are experiencing tremendous new outcomes when you understand that many of the families, many of the children that you serve, there is some trauma going on in their lives or they've experienced, which really explains some things about behavior, about brain development, as we're going to talk more about later in the training. So what is trauma? Well, trauma, I really pretty much use a lot of the core of the content from this class from SAMHSA, certainly a safe guide and kind of holy grail on this topic, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. So they define trauma as 3 E's. An individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or set of circumstances that we experience that can be life-threatening or feel overwhelming and can have lasting adverse effects in many ways. Let's take a look at those E's one at a time. So the potential traumatic events, we can range here in 3 columns. And if we had longer today, and I sure look forward to getting back to training folks in person. It was really nice last week to train some police officers in person. That was the first in-person training I've done since March of this year. But if we had a longer session, I would arm you with some sticky notes and markers, and I would allow you to give some input on this, making up these lists. And as we look at these lists, we might see our own story here. We might be victims of abuse at times, or chronic stressors. So again, I'm not sure of all the demographics represented today, whether you're with DCS or foster care or youth mentors, park and rec, school system, but many we know of that we serve that might be involved with poverty. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of trauma now around the historic trauma caused by racism, or a child in a home where there's an ongoing medical procedure, either in their life or that of a caregiver, historical trauma, family member with substance use disorder, or a family member incarcerated, and then the category of loss, a death of a family member, abandonment, natural disaster. Some of the trainings that I deliver, I talk about 2 types of trauma, and there's natural trauma and then there's created trauma. And right now with COVID-19, really this global pandemic, that's an example of a natural trauma. And one thing about natural trauma is it's very publicized, it's very in the news, and it's something where we see community empathy and here, you know, our healthcare leaders' heroics, our teacher heroics, where teachers are been like in a batting cage with the ball, you know, coming 50 miles an hour and then 90 miles an hour. And I tell you, my hat is off to our educators, our school staff, where they've had to pivot around the things that are going on with around COVID. But this is a very open type of trauma. But in created trauma, that's long been not that it should be always discussed or we have to know the stories of it, but we've known there are effects from it. Things like domestic violence, a child growing up in a home where there's a parent incarcerated, or ongoing addiction. And so one of my hopes as we move through this COVID pandemic is that now we see greater empathy towards the created trauma that we have seen worldwide around the natural trauma of COVID. Okay, so the experience of trauma can be affected by how did it happen? When did it happen? Where and how often? So as I was developing trainings early on in 2014 and 15, working for the police, I talked to our child crime investigator, and they told me that 90% of the time, crimes against children are through known caregivers. And if there, again, are folks on this training today from DCS or CASA, Child's Advocate Centers, you know that to be true. It's not often that it's a stranger that is inflicting abuse or neglect upon someone. So the delivery of that event or how it happens. I've been muted. Hello. Oh, okay. Those things can impact the effects of trauma. Not sure what happened there. Hold on. If you're trying to say anything to me in the chat, I can't seem to open it. Okay. So that's the second E of trauma, is the experience. All right. Another thing to consider about the experience are the factors that increase the impact. Is the early occurrence, blaming and shaming is often involved, being silenced or not believed, and that the perpetrator is a trusted caregiver. Okay, the third E of trauma are the effects of trauma. And so if one of us today had an arm wrapped up in a bandage or was using crutches, then it would be evident to us all that someone has an adaptation to an injury, or maybe recovering from a surgery. And so the next few slides, I want you to start thinking about these behaviors as what may be a normal response to someone that's living in an abnormal situation. So one of the stories I tell, when I was working with police, I oversaw the development for 4 years of an intensive outpatient recovery program for felony offenders with addictions. I worked with the judges in the First Judicial District, as well as probation and parole, Frontier Health, and many, many community partners. And in that program, I heard stories of extreme hardship to many in the criminal justice system, that their beginning in life was very, very traumatic. And trauma is not an excuse for drugs or crime, but now it offers us an explanation. And so one day, a woman that was in the program began to tell about her mother being a heroin addict, and her whole life, that her job as a little girl was, her youngest memories was pulling her mother out of the toilet when she would shoot up with heroin, because her mother would get very sick at her stomach. And her older sister would be screaming, let her drown, while she would retrieve her, pull her back out of the commode. And she went on to tell how that one time her sister was 10, she was 8, and they had a brand new baby sister, 4 weeks old, and the mother left for a couple weeks, and they didn't have a cell phone or any way of knowing her, or where she was or when she'd be back. And these little girls navigating this hard situation with this little infant. And I said to her that day, first of all, I'm so sorry that was your start in life. Professionals, we don't pick where we start in life. Who would pick that kind of beginning? I have grandchildren, and my son, when they leave our house, he said, Mom, you stand out on the porch like the Santa at the mall. I'm just waving. You'd think that the Macy's Day Parade is going down my street. But I'll tell you what, my little grandchildren are never going to wonder if grandma and grandpa are excited to see them. Why? Because we're demonstrating that. And then this young woman was telling about, facing these things of hardship in her life. So that day I said to her, counseling is a part of your treatment plan here, and you need to be able to have someone to help you to resolve the fact that that part of your story was not your fault. And so the next time I was over there, she handed me a piece of paper and said, thank you, Miss Becky, for treating me like a person. And so, to her, that was a normal childhood. And really, until she was able to get in a different environment and avail herself to counseling, did she see that for many individuals, that is not at all what childhood looks like. Okay, so some of the physical reactions to trauma. So a few years ago, when I trained 175 regional school nurses, they're all shaking their head up and down at this slide because they all know every year they're going to have the frequent flyer in their office with the aches and the pains. And even now more where, you know, I've already heard incidences of schools that are meeting back in person. And, you know, when a child, you know, has some sort of symptoms, well, with the threat of COVID, you know, my heart goes out to educators and nurses in the fact that you're trying to sift through what is safe and what are good precautions. But many times some of those aches and pains and chronic stomach aches, that kind of thing, it could be because that child is witnessing violence at home. And the national conversation that I'm a part of, there are grave concerns that during this time of quarantine and isolation, that many have been cut off from the healthy relationships in their life at school. All right, so look at some emotional reactions to trauma. You can look through the list here and may recognize, you know, some of these and those that you serve. Take a look at how the brain is derailed now from trauma. So the brain development starts with the bottom-up organization. When a little baby is born, the bottom controls the most simple functions, such as respiration, heart rate, blood pressure. The top areas control the more complex. So in this little diagram, the red and the yellowish areas on the top, the cerebral cortex, that's the part of the brain where a child is learning putting things in order, to put them in, group it by size or color or the alphabet, those types of functions. Emotional regulation, that happens in the upper part and the more somewhat of the midsection of the brain. And the bottom part, the brainstem, controls the vitals. So at birth, the brain's underdeveloped. Not all the brain's areas are functional, but a child's going to develop these in sequence. That's why when a baby is born, you don't expect a new baby to be, you know, walking, running, speaking full sentences. No, because they're going to develop their brain in sequence, and you're going to see that sequential development play out in the fact that they're first going to roll over or sit up, crawl before they walk, babble before they talk. Actually, you know, I didn't know till my daughter-in-law was expecting and our son, our first grandchild. I had no clue with grandmothers and grandfathers what a big deal it was of what they will call you. And every time I would say to a friend, we're going to be grandparents, the first question out of their mouth was, what are they going to call you? And I really hadn't thought a lot about it. So finally I settled on Grammy. Well, when my the granddaughter was born, and as she learned to talk, she couldn't do the grr. And so I am now and forevermore Naomi. And I just love it. So really, I should have just figured out I'll let them name me. But anyway, that was all because of this sequential development. So here's an interesting slide. And I used this when I spoke last spring to the, spring before last, to the Senate Health Committee in Tennessee to tell our legislators why they need to understand and looking at legislation about ACEs. So on one side, we see what's labeled a healthy brain. And if you notice the circled areas, that's the cortex. That's the part that I was just describing, the upper part of the brain. And so the one with a healthy brain, notice how colorful it is, particularly in the circled areas. Now that's because that child has had a nurturing caregiver. Now we know in Tennessee and in most states, there's a lot of relative caregivers. There's grandparent adoption. There's all kind of, it could be foster parents. And so even though certainly biological parent is a best case scenario, but the main thing is a child during this time, 0 to 6 of their brain development, has to have a a nurturing caregiver to be able to do a process called serve and return. And so when the serve and return, reading a book, saying numbers, my little grandchildren, they're saying numbers and colors, and what is happening there, that's all serve and return, and that has to happen for the brain to develop. Now look on the other side. The other one is labeled an abused brain. I'd really say it's more of a neglected brain. It's a Romanian orphan, the same age as the child on the other side. But this child has had food and clothing and shelter, but they've not been afforded the opportunity to have a lot of caregiver impact. that they're not getting rocked at night, they're not getting books read to them. And so look at the brain development. This is science. And so we've had the perfect storm when we open, you know, the doors to our preschool or Head Start or our schools, because now we have these two children sitting side by side, and the paperwork says their children, has a date of birth, has a birth certificate, we meet a caregiver. But what comes into our program, this child is not developed the same, and therefore they're not going to be able to learn the same without us learning to put in some strategies, which we're going to cover more near the end of this training. Okay, so the fire alarm of the brain is the amygdala. That's the top part of the brain. That's the frontal lobes, and it's actually made to shut down when we feel our life is threatened. And that's when our amygdala, a little kind of a pea pod shape at the base of the brain, it goes into work. If while we were in this training, you know, you heard a loud noise wherever you are, and maybe a animal got in the garage or something like that, I don't know, depending on what that animal is, you know, you might have some bit of concern or hysteria. And when that happens, your amygdala goes to work and your cerebral cortex shuts down. But your amygdala can only do three things. Your survival mechanisms are only three things. This is why it's important for police to learn about this, because many times trauma survivors have a highly developed amygdala, and amygdala can only do three things: fight, flight, or freeze. And so here we see a description of the fight, flight, or freeze, which pretty much self-explanatory. But remember, a few minutes ago, I talked about the adaptations to trauma, or wearing your arm in a crutch, or your arm in a cast, or you're having crutches to show an adaptation to an injury. So now when we have a child for no reason at all, typically they're pretty good and pretty engaged, but now they're fighting and combative one day, or maybe they're just, you know, wanting to dart out, or being resistant, or just shut down. Oftentimes, you know, I've trained several juvenile justice systems in a couple of states, and working with judges to help them to recognize these behavior in youth. It doesn't mean that a youth that's passive or unmotivated, you know, not necessarily is that willful behavior, but when we're trained to understand trauma-informed care, we can see maybe that's survival behavior. You know, folks, I get super passionate about this topic, and I'm really pleased. In a couple weeks, I'll be presenting in the state of California. I wish that it was going to be in person, but they bumped it to be virtual now. But I'll be presenting with their Surgeon General, Nadine Burke-Harris, who's quite a hero of mine around this topic. And Dr. Burke-Harris, she's working with California to begin to do screening on ACEs statewide, so that we begin to understand that there are sometimes circumstances going on in the child's life away from the program, away from foster care, away from school, that is contributing to the social determinants of health. And so, in talking with some folks, you know, recently I was talking about, what if in the medical profession, what if there was a disease, even COVID, which is something right in front of us, what if it had been being misdiagnosed for years and years? In 1979, the Surgeon General of that time, under President Carter, said the #1 public health concern was violence, and particularly violence against children. And that's been 41 years. And what if we'd have waited 41 years to act on how to prevent COVID? You know, think of how many people would have been impacted by it, even more than what already has. But what if the medical profession was misdiagnosing disease? Would we allow that to continue? But so much of the time in our professions where we're working with children, working with youth, we've been trained, and we just identify their behavior as willful behavior. But now, thanks to understanding trauma-informed care, we're now being able to recognize that behavior as survival. So instead of the children that maybe we've been punishing, now we just have an understanding that maybe those are children that we should be protecting. You know, professionals, when a child is loved at home, they come to school to learn. But when a child is not being loved at home, they come to school to be loved. All right, so we're going to watch another video here about how brains are built. I know some of you have probably seen it many times, but it's a good one.
have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Okay, so in that video, talked about how brains are built, and it talked about the process I told you about a few minutes ago, serve and return, like a ping pong match or a tennis match. So maybe somebody on the training today is our local tennis champion, but you never got out there and played a good game of tennis all by yourself. And professionals in that video, did you hear where they said that a child must have help? So I don't know what populations you serve, but I'm sure that anyone that's involved working with children, working with youth, you're aware of a home story where you're pretty sure that that child is not getting some sort of serve and return activity. And the video, as the video indicated, that is essential for a child's brain development to have serve and return. And then moving beyond serve and return, the video describes it as building bricks. And then what you want to do with some of the bricks that you you have is build a building called air traffic control. And air traffic control is emotional regulation. So if you're a teacher or a school counselor or a school nurse or a cafeteria worker, a couple weeks ago, I had the privilege of, I've been working with the entire school district in Virginia, Southwest Virginia. Last year, I did training for the principals, all the teachers, and they had me to do training a couple weeks ago for all the bus drivers, cafeteria, custodians, school nurses, and the administrators, because they're serious about implementing a trauma-informed approach into their whole district. And they know that everyone needs to understand what trauma behavior looks like. And so a child that might just have sudden outbursts, sometimes we see that in adults. You know, I don't really remember as a kid or teenager really road rage and things like that. And, you know, oftentimes we see people that are very explosive, and many times that is because the emotional regulation is not developed. So this is another slide that's a favorite of mine. So if you look at the slide at the bottom, the pyramid that's upside down, it's labeled typical brain development. And we want you to see again, ACEs and trauma-informed is not a fad. It's not a movement. This is science, okay? So typical brain development should be in an upside down pyramid fashion, where the amygdala, or this is labeled survival, the amygdala part of the brain where a child falls down and mom or dad or granny picks that child up and kisses that boo-boo. And that child is made to feel safe. And so there's some activity in the amygdala, in the survival part, but then a whole lot of development and activity in the cognition and in the cognitive part of the brain, okay? But then look on the other side, when a child is exposed to addiction in the home, and you know, the more that I've worked in this topic in Southwest, in rural Appalachia since 2014, you know, I've heard stories of teenagers sleeping in their closet at night at 15, falling asleep in school, and then the teacher learns that a caregiver, a parent, is a drug addict, and then that child's being violated by other people that come around the drug activity when their caregiver is passed out. And so to keep themselves safe, they're sleeping in a closet and put the feet up against the door so that when a intruder tries to come in, at least they're jarred awake. You know, professionals, no child ought to be spending the night sleeping in their closet in fear of at their own home. But we know many children that are. A local school system, some of the school board members have told me that every year 300 to 400 children are classified as homeless. Now, it doesn't mean those children are living under a bridge or sleeping in a car, though a very small percent might be. But basically, it means when that child leaves the school class at the end of the day, the teachers really don't know where they would find them until the next day. And what's even more concerning is generally that child doesn't know where they're going. So when children are growing up in that kind of environment, then we see the developmental trauma brain on the other side, where the broad part of that brain that's highly developed is the survival mechanism. So that's why we have two kids sitting side by side that are not adjusting to learning the ABCs or having the same attention span or being able to have the same amount of emotional regulation. Okay, so a simple activity to help us understand the whole brain. And at the end of the slides, and I'll send the slides to Jillian and she's free to share them. There's a wonderful book called Understanding the Whole Brain Child by Dr. Dan Siegel, and I've got a copy of it. I'd recommend if you want to really get more involved in this, it's about $14 and you can get a copy. But this is an exercise that he has in that book, and many of the schools that I'm working with are teaching the children this. I'm on the board locally of the Boys and Girls Club, and all of our staff there, all of our volunteers are trauma informed. We have a calming room because we understand that instead of having a list of children that cannot return for their behavior, now we know because of trauma, those are the children, the very children that we need to hold the tightest to. And so we're helping them to learn what part of their brain acts like what. So if you think about your hand, the top part of your hand, your upper four fingers, that's the cortex, and your thumb is the amygdala. So in the workbook, it talks about this is your brain. And so while we're listening today, this is our brain. And then if the bear runs in the room, your cortex is going to shut down, or literature calls this flipping your lid, okay? So your cortex shuts that's down, because now you've got to figure out what to do with this bear that's come in my house. So your amygdala goes hard to work. So one of the principles that I've worked with when a high school student, there's a fight or swear words, they come into the principal's office, and the first thing she does, she draws a little house, and she said, Joey, are you upstairs or are you downstairs? And Joey said, I'm downstairs, but I've stayed upstairs all week. Why? Because those students are learning what kind of behavior and what kind of function is associated with the upstairs brain and what kind is associated with the downstairs. And so we want to realize that as we navigate stress, as we navigate trauma, that all of our lives are subject to a certain amount of trauma. This is a slide off one of the wonderful, the Tennessee Building Strong Brains program, which I was in a first cohort in 2017 to become a trainer of that. And I love this slide. And the next one I have, where it talks about different levels of stress. Now notice in each of in the pictures, a little girl in a pink top, okay? So it's kind of this little girl navigating these different levels of stress, all right? So in positive stress, we have this little girl meeting new people, going to, a new class, or maybe even now, all the way around for teachers, parents, administrators, and kids, navigating what does school look like around COVID-19. A certain amount of stress could be involved. But, as we navigate some of those stressful situations, public speaking, some of the things that we do, interviewing for a new job, once we jump over that, it gives us confidence and courage to try other things that are challenging. But notice in the middle screen, or the middle graphic, that how much bigger the size of the boulder is. And notice it's labeled a death in the family. Now, certainly that would be much more traumatic than meeting new people, okay? But notice what the little girl has at the top. She has a support system. I really miss interaction here, and maybe some of you are trying in the chat, but some reason I can't seem to open it. But notice that she has a support system, and so that is super important, protective factors, and we'll talk about that more towards the end of the training. But that we all have a support system or protective factors, so she is able to navigate that big boulder because she has help. But look over on the end and look at what these boulders are labeled: parental addiction, abuse, neglect. And notice she has no support system. And I'd like to interject that she has no support system because it's likely the source of the toxic stress is coming from those that should be a support system. So if we get real scientific and we put this on a graph, notice that the positive stress, meeting new people, having a job interview, a first day of college, how that stress peaks up. But in time, then there's not the anxiety around it, okay? But then the middle one, tolerable, you lose a loved one or lose a pet. Actually, a little while ago, my husband sent me a photo of us at Roan Mountain 2 years ago with a dog that he just loved. And 2 years ago, that dog passed away. And I'll tell you what, he has had such a hard time. I think it's because both our boys are grown and married, and this dog came in our lives kind of as a just a runaround pal for my husband. And here we are 2 years later, and at lunch he's sending me a picture from Roan Mountain of just him thinking about laying in the grass with our old dog Cooper. And so sometimes with tolerable stress, the stress will go down, but then maybe a holiday or that loved one's birthday, something will remind us and it'll peak back up. But again, notice how in time it becomes manageable and goes down. But look at toxic stress, ongoing, never letting up. And that is why I was offered a role for 1.5 years that I was there in healthcare, because we know now that when that amygdala is activated and it's putting cortisol in our bodies like a fire hose from a fire hydrant, it has very unhealthy effects. There are certain types of cancer now, diabetes, certain types of heart problems that are all associated with elevated levels of cortisol, too much use of the amygdala. Okay, so behavior is like an iceberg. We only see the small portion above, but below are the feelings and emotions driving the behavior. So the misbehavior we often see is the child's attempt to solve a whole nother problem of which we're unaware. So what does trauma look like? I have all different variations of this: healthcare, homeless services, police, but I picked out the one for working with kids. So we may have the little child that's just a kind of a loner, and it might really not be that they're shy. Maybe to them, bad things happen when you're around people. Or the little child that's angry, just blows up for every little type of thing. The child that's disconnected, the child that's hypervigilant, all those are little faces that could be traumatic survivor behavior. All right, so again, this is some good information from the Tennessee Building Strong Brains material. So if we could imagine in all of our brains, metaphorically, there's a fulcrum. And I saw this when I did classes for juvenile court in 2 counties many years ago. I saw these young people were so negative, and none of them felt like they were ever going to have any positive breaks in life or future. And professionals, one of the greatest travesties of trauma is it robs individuals of any kind of hopes or dreams. And I'm sure you're aware of numbers, but in Tennessee, the second leading cause of death of children ages 10 to 17 is suicide. And what does that tell us? That children are experiencing a lot of trauma so that they feel like that there's not a, what is my hope? What is my future? I'm actually working with a young Pakistani gentleman who's in Lithuania. And if you Google this after the training, find the #1 country where death by suicide, and it's Lithuania. 1 of every 3 people in Lithuania will end their life with suicide. And it's because they do not have, they're not a relational folk. And so we see the fulcrum is moved to negative things. So if you have a lot of positive in your life, that fulcrum is shifted to positive outcomes. If you've had a lot of negative abuse, neglect, even it could be verbally, where people are, when parents are negative verbally to a child, tell the child they're a loser, you're never going to amount to anything, I'm disappointed in you. Do you know that the child doesn't stop loving the caregiver? Do you know who the child stops loving? Themselves. And so that fulcrum is shifted in a negative position. But the wonderful thing about trauma-informed care, we've learned we could shift the fulcrum. And one high school that I've worked with, the juvenile system that sometimes had some of the kids on their caseload that were at that high school, they said, the judge told me that they were shocked that some of the kids were saying they wish the school wouldn't let out for the summer. 1 year, because the parents, the teachers got it, and they were supportive, and they were inspirational, and they were hopeful. And so what were they doing? They were shifting the fulcrum for those young people. All right, so we're going to see 2 little videos here back to back, and these are what I call resilience case studies. And so with the things that we've already learned, I want you to see how that in both of these true stories, and the young men, first is Chad and then is Josh, they're going to tell their own story, and I want you to see what caused this child, their story, to turn around. And the first one, it has to do with school and a coach, a mentor. And then the next one, it has to do with support from family. And then some things that this young person went on to do themselves. Okay. You might want to have some tissues handy. Both of these stories really tug at your heart. The first one is Chad's story.
It's just hard with that. I was just a kid. Because here everybody knew our business, knew what was happening to us, and it was brutal. Oh my God, there's a school. If you go right up here, there's a turn, and you can situate it. Tough thing back here. Yeah. This is crazy. were some good times though. Like we'd have a good 30 minutes or so before we heard the sliding glass door open. And one day he came in and he actually had pizza, like supreme pizza. And another day, everything it was fine. And another day he came in, for no reason, he just smashed my mom's head against that cabinet there. Just thinking of, just to the left of where they're playing, it's where my brother and I would play. My dad, he would come home and we had to be really good at sports and stuff, so. There's one time where we're sitting, I knew it was coming. I knew my brother, Bobby, I knew that he would be the one to bear the brunt of it. And so I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Chad reminds me of a lot of the kids that have come through here. Angry, very angry. And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. And he finally came clean and told me his father had major anger issues. He said, you know, I need to talk to somebody. And I instantly thought of Coach Morrow.
Good job. Chad wasn't a football player per se. He was just a kid that had energy that needed to do something. He needed to be a part of something because I don't think he had anyone as a role model or someone showing him what to do. On the whistle.
Coach Morrow was the only person I really trusted in this town. He was always there.
Yeah. There was times I would give him a ride home. We would talk. Sometimes we wouldn't talk. You ready for that? But it was interesting to have a discussion with someone, a young man who had no one to talk to.
He was the only one there for my graduation. Even my family wasn't there.
You're doing good. You're okay.
I just remember when you were walking across, I just remember looking up. He had this big old, just ear to ear grin.
It takes a village to raise a child. And it doesn't matter what nationality, what race, we're all from the human race. If you interact with someone, it shows them that you care.
Good memories, you know? You gotta hold on to those.
It's love thy neighbor. It's what we should do.
When was the last time you saw him?
About 8 years ago. And actually right over here is Lucille's barbecue. The best barbecue you'll ever have in your life. And Coach Morrow actually took me there, like after high school graduation. But take this right. It's gonna be your first right over there. Just pull in, not this one, but. I freaking knew it. I freaking knew it. I did too. I knew something was up.
No,
I knew something with that. I knew it. I knew you all were doing something.
no, you did good. There he is.
Yeah. I heard you were in town. I knew you couldn't pass up some Lucille's, man. Oh, good to see you. I'm so proud of you. You've done well. You've done well.
Okay. So, okay. Oh, this little thing is hiding. There we go. All right, here's Josh's story. And the thing I love about both of them is the happy ending.
Missing and loving his father. From what I understand, his father passed away, and he would have pictures of him in his locker. Some students thought it would be a good idea to rip down those pictures and harass him and bully him for missing and loving his father.
Going through what I went through, you kind of keep to yourself. You don't know who you are or anything. You're just walking through the space, empty space. It's kind of like a puzzle. You're trying to find your way to the good things in life.
No one wants to be bullied. Everyone wants to feel like they mean something to somebody.
It's definitely a hard 4 years of your life, you know?
Even like a few words can affect someone so negatively.
I'd sit in the cafeteria alone. I wouldn't talk to anyone. Even if people invited me to sit with them, I didn't feel this was my place to be, you know?
Coming to a city school, a lot of people said, you're just going to make it worse. I didn't know what else to do for them. So yeah, we just took the jump. I was pretty scared, you know. I kind of thought the city experience, maybe a bigger high school rather than a small town high school, it just might be better.
I hope that attending the school, I would be treated like everyone else. Yeah, I just wanted to make it and just be a normal kid. I was sick and tired of being a no one. I wanted to be someone and wanted to reach out to people and show who I was.
I just remember at first they called him the doorman. They thought he was weird.
It was definitely kind of weird. It took a while for people to adjust. But once people realized that he was continuing with it, it almost became something to look forward to in the morning. Like, you walk up the stairs and you know that Josh Yant's going to be standing there with a big smile on his face saying good morning.
No problem.
The first few weeks when I started doing it, they were kind of shocked.
Good, you? Thank you.
Not many people hold doors, right? But after that, people started to open up to me. Opening a door is more than a physical act. It's about putting yourself out there, getting to know people, making them feel comfortable, making them feel welcome.
Thank you. No problem.
Opening doors, it gives people hope that people care.
I think that was his way of saying I'm here and I'm not going to be invisible anymore.
He had literally, just by holding doors and saying good morning, he had turned, like, he'd made a drastic change in his life.
It was definitely a positive effect. Like, it made people want to do nice things for other people. Like, he set a good example for other students.
Everything changed huge. I mean, everyone said it. All the teachers, the students felt it. They talked about it, you know, that he changed things in the school. And he was a changed Josh.
We were honored to have Josh. We were privileged. Any school would have benefited.
I think Prom King was a way to say thank you from the students and the staff. So when he won, it was like his moment to shine.
When we heard Josh Yant's name pulled out, it was like pretty much everyone should have just ran up there and been Prom King because it felt like everybody won.
Yeah, he's standing tall and straight. He's got the big grin on his face and got the crown.
I never expected to get an award or anything like that. I was just happy enough to make it through.
Just 1 year and things are totally turned around, totally. And it would have been fine if the story stopped there. It could have, and it would have been okay. And he still would have been the same person.
All right, guys, so now is the moment. Let's all line up to the side of the room. Once we're all lined up quietly, we will head down to the gym.
I would have never thought he would be a public speaker because he had been so shy, but he took to public speaking like a duck to water.
He draws them in, and it's this aura, it's this personality that he exudes. He's been there, and so they relate to him in that respect.
When I'd heard your story, it kind of made me feel like I could be more like myself. It changed the way I thought about things. It changed the way, like, how I felt about myself.
I personally think that you shouldn't let, like, what's going on around you affect your personality or the way you act.
I think he shows them just be courageous. You know, don't let the bullies get you down. Just, you know, fight back in your own way, maybe with a little kindness.
It's amazing how just one simple act can change your whole life. I never thought doing something so simple could be so rewarding.
Isn't that amazing and inspiring and both of those stories, Chad's story where, you know, he's in a home where there's,
My name is Melissa Clark. I was very sick as a child and I needed a heart transplant.
hold on. All right. So in Chad's story, we see that, you know, he has a violent father. And again, you know, that's not his fault, but we see a teacher is sensitive to understanding that something must be going on in Chad's life and just hooks him up to the coach. And at the end, you can really see what a difference that coach is making in his life. And then Josh's story, I mean, you know, how cruel for kids at school to be, you know, bullying him around the death of his father, but through the support of his mother and then Josh's own resilience, you know, he decides in a new school that he's going to make a difference and ends up really being an inspiration to the whole school. A national campaign, I'm on a core team for a national trauma campaign, and one of our other core members, some of the people are policy people and in Washington, D.C., and some are in some way or another have been involved in national and trauma-informed care work. And one of our team members, probably our youngest, her name is Peyton Barcel. You could look her up. I think she's 19 now. She lives in Nevada, Las Vegas. And Peyton lost her father when she was 9 years old. And though she goes to a school that she, you know, feels cares about her and fits in and all. But that year that her father died was so hard on her. And it was almost as if her teachers and those at school just didn't really know what to do with it. And you know, it was kind of like, I guess the way they say, the elephant in the room. And so here this little Peyton, as she grows into a teenager, she begins to work with legislators out there. And lo and behold, she was able to get passed into law in the state of Nevada, where all the teachers in the state of Nevada have to watch a 30-minute video that she was able to help produce on understanding trauma in the lives of your students. And so sometimes through some of the most difficult tragedy comes some of the most resilient stories. And that's what Josh and Chad are here, okay? So we want to think about in our programming, what are we doing that's a charging station? And that's a great metaphor that Frameworks and the Tennessee Building Strong Brains program developed, so we all get it. We all have technology, we have smartphones, we have iPads, even my computer right now is, you know, plugged up. But sometimes when we are working with other staff, or our family members come home at the end of the day, or the students that you serve, or work within a park and rec program or foster parent, instead of the battery being charged up, the battery is running out. And so what are we doing around individuals to be supportive? And these two young men just showed how that, they're not very costly interventions, but just that human contact. I saw before COVID, back in the winter, I saw a story one night on the CBS Nightly News of a woman in Utah who's a bus driver. And this woman was talking about loving driving a bus, and that in the school year last year, that a little girl at 11 years old would get on the bus, was a friendly little girl. She just enjoyed seeing her every day. But one of the things that struck her about this little girl was that every day that she got on the bus, her hair was braided in a cute little braids. And so into the school year, late in the fall, into the winter, there came a Monday that she noticed the little girl didn't get on the bus. And the next day, little girl missing again. The next day, missing. And it went a whole week, and the little girl is missing off the bus. And then the following week on Monday, she was so relieved to see the little girl get back on the bus that she said to her, "Oh, I missed you last week." One of the things that the bus driver noticed, the little girl didn't have her hair braided. So she thought, well, maybe the family slept over, and the next day, again, the little girl back on the bus, no braids. The next day, no braids. So finally on Thursday, the bus driver said to the little girl, "I sure miss your braids." And the little girl stopped and she looked at the bus driver. It's a true story. And she said, "Last week, my mommy died, and my daddy doesn't know how to braid hair." And, professionals, that bus driver, after she dropped the kids off that day, she made a beeline to Walmart. She got a new hairbrush. She got a bag of bows. And every day after that, she asked the little girl just to stay behind a minute, and she brushed her hair and she put it up in braids. And this was so impressive to the teachers of that little girl, because this little girl's spark began to come back, that the teachers reported it to the principal, who reported it to the superintendent, and it was on their local news and ended up making the CBS Evening National News. And that all was through the empathy, all of that through the kindness. That healing process began to happen in that little girl, all through the kindness and the empathy of a bus driver. So one of the strongest messages of this training today is that you don't have to be a therapist to have a therapeutic approach and a therapeutic impact. So healing begins through learning skills to build resilience and the caring support of others. And a great little piece, I've got the article cited below there, but the Journal of American Medical Pediatrics had an article. Instead of ACEs, they called it, I guess, PACEs. But the research shows that positive childhood experiences buffer against the health effects of adverse ones. The proactive promotion of positive childhood experiences for children may actually reduce the risk for adult depression, poor mental health, and promote relational health. So right now, one thing we're all very aware of is wearing masks. Here in Johnson City, some of our big main billboard signs are all masked up. What is that for? It's to show that a proactive buffer against COVID-19 could be wearing a mask. So now we need to see that positive experiences that we have with children can offset the effects of these traumatic things that we've talked about so far in the training. Okay, so protective factors, which we're going to go into more in detail later on. Protective factors are conditions or attributes in individuals and families and communities that help people deal more effectively with stressful or traumatic events. And some of those protective factors can be things like having concrete support, folks that that you can count on, maybe in a time of need, relational skills, building good relational skills, self-regulation skills, and problem-solving skills. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about each one of those when we talk about strategies later on in the training. Okay, so we're just a few minutes before our 90-minute mark, but we're at kind of a good parking spot. So Jillian or Shannon, if you can resurface, why don't we go ahead and take our break right now? And I'm going to set a timer. Let's see if somebody's coming to life here.
I'm here, Becky.
Okay, great. And we will take a 15-minute break and come back and finish up. Thank you, Shannon.
You're welcome. It's always a great pleasure hearing your ACEs training. Does do such a great job. My name's Shannon Payne. I'm the Peak Mentorship Program Coordinator for the City of Elizabethton. We take at-risk youth and match them up with a positive influence to try to change their lives. So right now we're going to do a little mindfulness meditation. It's about 11 minutes long. It's just problems big and small. So just kick back and relax and just listen to the cool voices.
Some problems in life are inherently big. Others are much smaller. But sometimes we take these small problems and we think about them so much that in the end, we're faced with a big problem. So this is something that all of us do all of the time. We take these little smaller problems in our life and we tend to hold on to them. We create a story around them. We think about them a lot. We invest a lot of our time and our energy in these things. And as a result, they become something much bigger in the mind. But if we're able to practice with awareness, if we're able to see when we're getting involved in that thinking, and at that stage, to let go, to disengage, and to come back to whatever we're doing at the time, and to practice that on a regular basis, then it means that these smaller problems never reach the stage of becoming a bigger problem in the mind or in our life. So as you just take a moment or two to get comfortable, just setting up the exercise with the eyes open. Without moving the eyes, make sure you can see the space around you, either side, above, below. And just maintaining a very soft focus. Just beginning with some big deep breaths, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. And as you breathe out this time, just closing the eyes, allowing the breath to return to its natural rhythm. Beginning to feel the weight of the body pressing down, and different points of contact. Just settling into that space. And beginning to notice different sounds around you, just allowing those sounds to come and go. And bringing the attention back to the body now. Noticing any sense of heaviness or lightness in the body. Noticing if the body feels at all restless or perhaps particularly still right now. And then starting at the top of the head, just scanning down through the body, all the way down from head to toe. And as you become more aware of the body in general, starting to notice the breath, the movement of breath. Begin with just in a very general way, noticing which parts of the body move, that rising and falling sensation. And continuing to follow that movement. Beginning to notice each and every breath. Noticing if the breath's long or short. Following each in-breath and each out-breath. And as you continue to follow each breath, just to help maintain that focus, just counting the breaths as they pass. Realizing when the mind's wandered each time, just returning to that sensation. So as soon as you realize the mind's wandered, just gently coming back to the breath each time. And now letting go of that focus. Just for a moment, allowing the mind to be free. And as you bring the attention back to the body now, just coming back to that feeling of weight, of contact. Coming back to the space around you, the sounds, the smells. Just becoming more familiar. That space, the way you feel, posture. And then when you're ready, in your own time, you can just gently open the eyes again.
Wow. Anyone feel better after that? Mindfulness is a wonderful thing. Becky, is everyone back on it?
Sure. Thank you, Shannon.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you know, when you do exercises like that, it just makes you see how busy your brain is, you know, and it's just so, it's good for us in so many ways to learn to be quiet. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about ACEs science, adverse childhood experiences, and the prevalence of trauma, and then we're going to talk about some strategies. So this is actually what got the conversation going around trauma-informed care. Make sure that you're muted, just since Julian's recording this to be able to use later. So a couple of things we're going to cover in this section is understanding the ACEs study, how to recognize trauma, and then the prevalence of trauma. So we're going to see a little video here that will explain to you the ACEs study in about 5 minutes in a much more succinct way than I could, and then we'll talk about it. Oh, wrong one. That's wrong one. Okay. Hold on. I have all my videos hidden right up here where the thing keeps popping down.
What the ACE study did is it sought to take.
Stop. Sheesh. There we go.
If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer? What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. And Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
Okay, So, all right. So the ACEs study, as the video said, in the late 90s, two doctors, they were actually doing research independently and they learned about each other. So they came together to find out more information about the impact of childhood adversity. And what they uncovered, I don't think, I've heard this ACEs study called the most important research you never heard of. And thankfully, that's not the case. When I first began doing ACEs work and learned about it myself in 2014, I remember doing a PubMed search, and it was in the lower 1,000 or so published articles about it. And now it's, I'm sure, easily, in tens of thousands, so much work being around it. Now people looking at ACEs as an upstream approach to many of the challenges that are faced by every community in America. But what they did was they came up with 10 questions, and those 10 questions were scrolling on the screen of the video. 5 things, did you see this in your home before you were 18? And 5 things, did this happen to you? Now, there are some different variations of the ACEs study now, the ACEs survey now. Some groups have added things like bullying, community trauma, but what they learned by asking these 10 questions, and some of it were things like, did you ever feel like you wouldn't have anywhere to sleep or enough food to eat, or were you, hit or by a caregiver, kicked in a way that you were bruised, or did you ever, sworn at, those types of things? Did you live in a home where there was an addicted caregiver, caregiver with mental illness? Did you witness violence? And what they found was that adverse childhood experiences can affect adult health, that ACEs can have serious health consequences, and that what happens is when bad things can happen in all of our lives, as I mentioned at the beginning of the training, some of what we've already talked about may very easily be some of our story. Matter of fact, I don't do very many trainings where I don't get an email from a participant, or if it was in person, they'd stay after the end and talk to me, and people thank you for this training, and that they'll begin to share their own story, which I hold those in really a sacred place in my heart, where people have shared their stories. But when bad things have happened, we have 2 roads to travel. We can travel one road and have healthy coping mechanisms, or we can travel the other road where we don't have healthy support, and then we're still going to need to cope, but what we're going to choose is unhealthy coping mechanisms. And so we learn that ACEs can have serious consequences for adults that choose the adoption of health risk behaviors as coping mechanisms. Things like eating disorders or cutting. I've worked with individuals, teenagers sometimes, cutting, and the pain of the cutting is in a way therapeutic to them, because it gets their mind off the ongoing unstoppable pain that they're suffering all the time by being a victim of trauma. And often we see young people, underage smoking, underage drinking, and drug use, and sexual promiscuity. A lot of those things are these risk behaviors that then can lead to severe medical conditions and even early death. The most famous graphic from the ACEs study is this ACEs pyramid. And we see when the foundation of life has adverse childhood experiences, then the next layer of life we've already discussed, we're going to see the brain derailment, social, emotional, and a cognitive impairment, where literally the brain development is derailed by these experiences. And that's going to lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors. And then that's going to bring on disease, disability, social problems, and early death. And again, that's why our largest regional health system wanted to look at this as a backstop of social determinant of health, because we can keep building new floors for drug and alcohol treatment. We can keep building locally a jail that I know the cells are meant to hold 12 individuals. There's 26 individuals sleeping in there every night. And these are very costly solutions, but are they really solutions? Incarceration grew by 500% in America. We have more people incarcerated in America than any other country, and incarceration grew by 500% when around drug activity that became became criminalized. And now we know that many times individuals, as Dr. Folletti said here on this slide, that when they found a male who answered yes to 6 of those questions, was 4,600 times more likely to be an IV drug user than someone who said none of that happened. So imagine me hearing this when I'm working at the police department, and my job, one of my programs was overseeing a program to reduce recidivism of felony offenders with addictions. And so everyone in the program, it has in common addiction. And so now we see the significant risk factor that childhood trauma is to addiction. And I would dare say that not one of us on this training today, whether you're a youth that's a mentor in the program with Jillian and Shannon, or maybe you're a professional, a DCS, or a teacher, that there is not one of us that our profession is not interacting with people that are impacted by drug addiction, and maybe even our own lives and family members. And so I began to just do a little research on where is the education around connecting addiction to trauma. So we're going to watch a real short video that Robert Anda, who was one of the co-investigators, Vincent Folletti and Robert Anda's with the CDC, and he talks about the significance of the risk factor of childhood trauma to substance abuse. In other words, that it's very, very conclusive. And now if you would go to the website of a program like Betty Ford Foundation, you will see on their website mention of ACEs and trauma-informed care, because it's now very well recognized that it's a risk factor to trauma, to addiction.
What the ACE study did is it sought to take a look at how childhood experiences influence neurodevelopment, the adoption of health risk behaviors and risk factors for preventable diseases. We looked at 10 categories of adverse childhood experience. We looked at abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, childhood neglect, that included physical and emotional neglect, and what we called household dysfunction, which was growing up in households where there's mentally ill caregivers or mentally ill people in the home, household substance abuse, domestic violence, parental separation or divorce, or criminal behavior in the house. So those are the 10 categories of experiences that we called adversity. And what we found when we studied them is that they're really common. And the second thing we found is that when there's one of those types of experiences in the life of a child, that there tends to be multiple others. So they're common, they're highly interrelated, they co-occur. And the third thing that we found is if you add up the number of categories of experience, that there is this cumulative impact of those experiences on the risk of public health problems. Many of the leading causes of death in the United States are somehow associated with ACEs, things like stroke, diabetes, risk factors for HIV, AIDS, cancers, and the behaviors that lead to those. We found that people who have high levels of adversity in their lives tend to die younger, so it causes premature mortality. And in terms of morbidity, probably the greatest impact on morbidity is in the area of substance abuse and mental health. I think it's very safe to say that ACEs are a leading cause of both mental health and substance abuse. And everywhere this has been studied, there's this very powerful relationship between childhood adversity, mental health problems of various sorts, and substance abuse problems of various sorts. At this point in time, the way states can use the ACEs surveillance data, I think, is to point out that these problems, the mental health and substance abuse problems that are so prevalent, are largely preventable, that they're not necessarily destiny or genetics, they have genetic components, that many of those problems are very experientially oriented, that the traumatic stress of abuse and neglect and other ACEs affect neurodevelopment in a way that leads to mental health and substance abuse problems. So I think the major thing is to say that much of what happens in mental health and substance abuse can be prevented if we can reduce the level of stress in children's lives.
Okay, so from the words of Dr. Anda himself, that it is conclusive that it's not a small but a significant risk factor to mental health and addiction, which those are two of the costliest challenges that every community faces. So ACEs are fact, but the good news is they're not fate. So some children might be more susceptible than others to the toxic stress, but there can be adults, other adults beside the child's caregiver, that can feel the nurturing and caring role that'll actually buffer the effects of ACEs. And there's a capacity to actually repair brain development. You know, a child's brain, the plasticity of it is optimal when the ages of 0 to 6, but that plasticity reappears in adolescence and young teenage years. So it's kind of like a chance for a reboot. And even into adulthood, there's a certain amount of plasticity where our brain can be rewired. But you've heard the adage that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So it's much easier for a child's brain to develop as when they're in their early years. But there is a capacity to repair, and that interventions can make a difference. So raising awareness, and appreciate Julian and Shannon for the opportunity to have this class today, because that's what we're doing. We're continuing to raise awareness. So when I saw that the ACEs study said that a man that answers yes to 6 of these questions on the ACE study is 46% or 4,600 times more likely, and 4,600% increase, or 46 times more likely to be an IV drug user. I just pulled up the American Heart Association that says that if you don't exercise, you're 1.4 times more likely to have a heart attack. Or if you're a tobacco user, your chances are even greater, 50% chance of having a heart attack or having heart problems. And look at the amount of education now in our health plans around tobacco cessation and around increasing our exercise. So we want to go on that same thread, and that's what we're doing regionally to raise awareness to the impact of ACEs. So trauma and mental health. So whether your organization ever decides to do screening of ACEs, you know, personally, I've not necessarily recommended that. Here's why. I'm not opposed to it, but I know of people that sometimes even in a training will say, all right, everybody take out a pen and paper. We're going to take the ACEs study. And here's why I've never done that as a national educator. Number one is I feel like as we take that test, we want to be able to have some services that if we were today in this training to say, you know what, my score's a 9. And, you know, I just feel that in the overarching rule of trauma-informed care, do no harm, that we would want to be able to have a setting where we could at least have a conversation or something around that. But what I really strongly recommend is that every organization, every person that's involved with mentoring youth, as a youth pastor, a coach, a foster parent, whatever role it is that we use universal precautions. And these next few slides will tell you why. So in the mental health area, history of childhood trauma predicts all these things, that it's going to be an earlier first admission to mental health services, more frequent, longer hospital stays, more time in seclusion or restraint, greater likelihood of self-injury or suicide attempts, more medication use, and increased symptom severity. So these are national statistics from SAMHSA, and CDC data mirrors the same thing. But around 65% of all substance abuse clients report a history of childhood trauma. 75% of women, high rates of childhood trauma. Look at this, 92% of homeless mothers, severe histories of trauma. In 2013, the American Journal of Public Health said that homeless individuals have the highest ACE score of any population. And the prevalence of trauma in children. 60% of American children are exposed to violence, in crime and abuse in their home, school, and community. And we're not talking about through video games or TV, but this is actually exposed to violence. 40% of children are the direct victims of 2 or more violent acts. 1 in 10 are victims of violence 5 or more times before the age of 18. And 3.5 to 10 million children witness violence against their mother or their stepmother. And the reason for the broad gap there in the numbers is because statistically it takes 7 acts of violence before someone will reach out for an advocate program. And that's what gave me the idea to train police, was who's going to be called to the home the first time the violence happens, or the second time. If it's going to happen 7 times before a victim is going to reach out for an advocate service, maybe a family justice center or a shelter, then there's a lot of unreported violence. And when I worked for police in 2015 in our community, a rural community, there was an average of 9 to 11 911 calls a day coded domestic violence. So there are a lot of children growing up in homes where violence is prevalent. And look at this, in a study of juvenile justice, 94% of children had experienced trauma. You know, if I was presenting today about 94% of why people have Alzheimer or get cancer, you know, I would be like nominated for a Nobel Prize or something. But look at this, 94%. I mean, it almost shows that we could minimize our juvenile justice services by just mitigating the effects of childhood trauma through the kind of programs that the Carter County Anti-Drug Coalition and the school systems locally are doing by infusing this knowledge into their services. So why focus on trauma in children? Because eradicating child maltreatment in America could potentially reduce all these things that ACEs predicts. And look at this list. Look how costly these challenges are to every community. Okay, so now let's talk about the remainder of our time together. What are some trauma-informed approaches? And this is my favorite kind of part, is sort of how the rubber meets the road. So we're going to talk some things about strategy here for the rest of our afternoon together. So we want to talk about the first section of it, and then our section 4 will be some other really dealing in on the protective factors. But in this section, we're going to talk about why trauma-informed programs operate with a universal expectation that trauma has occurred. So pretty much we can see that based on the information that I just shared in that last module, that about 70% of those that we serve, pretty much we could expect are trauma survivors. The 4 R's of a trauma-informed program, organization or system, or household, we could say, and understanding the SAMHSA principles and 6 principles or pillars, and why each one is important, and we're going to give some examples. So kind of back to the trauma-informed programs operating with a universal expectation that trauma has occurred. 2 summers ago, I was invited by Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to speak at the Senator Tommy Burke Victims Academy in Chattanooga at UTC. And what they do is every year hold this academy for all the victim advocates from across the state. They have to apply for it. It's a rigorous process, and then they get accepted into this academy. And so there was about 70 or 80 that were there, and I was speaking one day. And my session was on why we need to have trauma-informed multidisciplinary teams. Because professionals, if we had more time today and even just took the people that are represented on this training today, and we named a couple of scenarios, and in that training I gave 3 examples. One example was a domestic violence, ongoing domestic violence in a home where there are children present. That was the first one. The second one, an 8-year-old child who is being subject to physical abuse. A third situation was a college student who had experienced being raped. And so I asked for individuals to come to the front and take each one of those scenarios and write the number of touch points in our community that survivor likely may pass through in navigating that terrible challenge in their life. And so they would begin to write things like, maybe if it was domestic with a child involved, maybe DCS is going to be called in, child protective services, or maybe we're going to look at a shelter, or maybe our school is going to be involved. Maybe the child's in the Boys and Girls Club. Maybe the child and the family attend church. And so very quickly, we're adding up 5, 6, 7. In each of those scenarios, police are involved. And that's what made me determine that police could not be left out of the understanding about trauma, because all of us need to recognize what a trauma survivor looks and acts like. So when we know that 70% of those that we serve, you know, what if our clientele, what if our consumers, 70% of our consumers were hearing impaired? Then we would have closed caption on all our videos. We would hire staff that is trained in sign language, or we would have a trainer on site. In other words, we would want to have the most effective delivery of our services as possible, because we know that those that are going to access them are hearing impaired. Or what if everyone spoke a foreign language? You know, I've worked for 2 jobs, police and healthcare, and both of those have to have a universal translating system. If someone shows up at the police department and speaks fluent Romanian, and yet they have an emergency, we have to know what they're telling us. And so there's a system that would switch over that would be able to translate what was going on, and the same in healthcare. And so what if individuals coming to access our service only spoke a foreign language? Well, then we would have people there that spoke that language. But what about the volume of people that are flooding into all of our services, and sometimes many of our team members that are all trauma survivors, but yet we've known nothing about that. And that's why, you know, these opportunities are really a great opportunity, so that we can all grow in our understanding of the universal prevalence of trauma. Okay, so a program that is trauma informed. So, you know, I hate to tell you, even though I appreciate you taking 3 hours of your time today, or 3.5 to join us, but it's not, trauma informed is not one and done. Okay, so you can leave this training today, and if Jillian provides a certificate for contact hours, I'm not sure, but you know, you can say, put it on your, you know, your CV or whatever. But it's going to take more to fully embed these concepts into an organization. I was working this morning. A few weeks ago, I trained all the child care leadership in the state of Mississippi, and now they wrote me back and asked me to help them develop a follow-up plan of how they can begin to embed these practices into every child care center in the state of Mississippi. And so I wrote back a proposal of what steps that I would encourage them to take next. And so this is kind of like the platform of the diving board, so to speak, of where we get started with our trauma-informed programs. So it's 4 R's that SAMHSA developed. So number 1 is we realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand there are potential paths for recovery. And all the programs represented today, we're your paths for recovery. That's good news. And so this training, pretty much we could check that one off, that we realize this. Number 2 is now through this training, we've been able to learn to recognize some of the signs and symptoms of trauma in our clients, our staff, our families, and others involved in the system. You know, folks, trauma is kind of like the wind. You don't see the wind, you see the effects of the wind. And so some of the content we share today is to help us recognize what trauma looks like. But now that brings us to number 3 and number 4 in our training. And of all the kinds of education that I've learned in my life, and all the education that I've shared with others in my career, no other education outside of my faith has impacted me like this contact has impacted me, in the fact that now we have an obligation to do something with it. And that's what has been so inspirational to me, is and Jillian's program, I mean, is really at the top of the list, and some of the work that they're doing in the Carter County over these years, since I say this very humbly, handed them the lens of what to do, you know, the trauma-informed lens, and then what them as champions have gone and done in the settings of their sphere of influence. So how are we going to respond, professionals, with this information? And how are we going to fully integrate this knowledge into our policies, our procedures, and our practices? And then how are we going to actively resist re-traumatization? Okay, so let's talk about now these 6 principles that SAMHSA came up with. They call them the 6 pillars of a trauma-informed approach that we need to have in our programming. So these things were developed with a change process in mind. Okay, so again, this training is not one and done. It's kind of like the tiny little snowball today started down the mountain and Trauma informed is not a destination, it's a journey. And I'm involved with many cities, many states in our nation that are somewhere along the way in that journey. But the good news is that you're on the journey, okay? And so these 6 pillars were developed by national experts, including trauma survivors. And the goal of them is to establish a common language and a framework for building programming and classroom settings and boys and girls clubs that have these 6 pillars in mind, that these are pillars that are healing, bring about a healing approach as we serve trauma survivors. And they're values based, and it's not a checklist, but it becomes a way of being. And so a lot of things about trauma-informed care, when I've trained foster care parents many years ago, about 80 foster care parents for Frontier Health, some of these were veteran foster care parents, and they began to report at the end. They said, man, we wish we would have known this a little earlier on, in the fact that, you know, oftentimes we just looked at that child's behavior as willful. And so now we're seeing more that it's not about willful, but it's about being survivor. So some of the steps they started taking looks a little different than maybe what a healthcare or a St. Jude's research clinic that's pretty well doing a lot of great things around trauma-informed care. And so, you know, it's not necessarily a checklist, but it's a way of being. All right, so let's take a look at these 6 principles. Here's a list of them, and we're going to go through them one by one. Okay, so number 1 is safety. So we want to think about, do the people that access your services, or if you're a foster parent or an adopted parent or a caregiver or a case management, whatever your role is that you're on this training today, do those that you interact with, do they feel safe? And you know, something that I've learned in doing this training as many years as I have, you know, oftentimes there is no type of evaluation. You know, we think, oh yeah, my program, everybody feels warm and safe. Well, have you ever asked your consumers? Have you lately called your own office? Have you tried to get an appointment with you? You know, sometimes to a trauma survivor that has a highly developed amygdala, and that means the fight, flight, and freeze are what's most activated, and the cognition, the part of reasoning and problem solving, you know, that's a hard part. And I learned that very significantly working with felony offenders. It was people couldn't seem to keep a calendar or schedule of time, and a lot of that we realized we had to begin to almost unpack that traumatic behavior, and in their case focus on their sobriety before we begin to talk to them about the job skills. And so sometimes some of our programming messages might be confusing, some of our signage might be overbearing, and so we want to think about, how do our programs communicate that they're safe? Not only safe for those we serve, but safe for you as a team member. Well, here's a couple simple ways. What might safety look like? Well, are your programs welcoming? Is it a welcoming environment? Does it feel welcoming to people? So when we did this training for a local housing authority, and they ended up having all their housing authority staff, even their maintenance, the people that, you know, treat the bed bugs and the, you know, plumbing fixes and all that. One of the things they did after the training was they wanted to move to a deeper embedding these principles in their program. So they did an environmental survey. And if anybody's interested in that, I have tools that I can recommend to you. If you'll, at the end will be my email, and you're welcome to email me. And I have a survey I recommend if you want to do what's kind of like an environmental walkthrough. I did that in some of the hospitals when I was in healthcare, but they did that in this housing authority, a big housing authority in one of the Tri-Cities. And one thing they found was in their main lobby of their main office, where people come to be able to, you know, find out they're going to be moving in housing, where they pay their rent, where they report any kind of problems or anything like that. The only things on the wall in the lobby were the little government statement that says that because this is federally funded, that we will prosecute you to the fullest extent if you are fraudulent in any way. Now, I understand that that statement has to be posted, but it's like the lobby was decorated in that. They had it on 4 or 5 walls. They sent me a photo of it later. And so basically the message was, we are going to prosecute you to the fullest extent, you know, if you mess up, which again, those are certainly rules and I understand that. But you know what they did? They sent me photos later and they had it on one wall in a nice location where people could see it, but they also had signs, welcome, we're glad you're here, and things that were much more inviting. So over here on the slide, you'll notice a couple of examples, and I'm sure if we could interact a little bit more than on Zoom today. You know, now I'm always snapping pictures. So one day I was over in Carter County at Walmart and I'm looking at customer service and, you know, here's a big happy to help. And then I noticed on a lot of the team members' badges is happy to help. You know, I can't imagine a more challenging place to work, honestly, than customer service at Walmart. Basically, all day long, you'll take back everything anyone brings you, no matter how long they've had it. Come on, we know it's true. How many have brought things back, you know, to Walmart? And they're saying, we're happy to help. Well, that's a culture. That's intentional that they're wanting that message to go along with the idea of business with Walmart. And then we have down below one of our principals that's been through training, Mr. Church. He's a principal up at Cloudland High and Roan Mountain, and he talks to his students about if our school culture is kind, whose responsibility is it that our school is kind? And so many of the students jump in this big poster, you know, that's on the wall, and they show that I am the I in kind. And so, you know, there could be 40 different ways for all the people that are on this training today that we can make our programming welcoming. Number 2 is consistent and predictable. Now, I know that nonprofits sometimes, and particularly now that maybe a lot of our office hours are one of the national groups I'm on, we have a thing called office hours once a month where people all around the nation can call in, and we have an hour where we answer questions and things like that. It's kind of a virtual office hours. And I know office hours may look like all kind of things to all as many partners are on this training. Not sure what, okay, but anyway, but the point is, if you say at 3 o'clock, whether it's going to be by Zoom or by phone, to a trauma survivor, think of it like this, that their world is turned upside down, and to you to implement and begin a healing process in your work with them, you must be consistent and predictable. Now, it doesn't mean sometimes things come up, but sometimes things coming up should be the exclusion, not the norm, okay? And then absolutely our services need to be offered in non-shaming, non-blaming, non-violent ways. We need to be respectful of privacy and confidentiality, clearly explain what is happening, why, and what's next, all right? Okay, so number 2 of these processes is trustworthiness and transparency. So we want to see that organizational operations and decisions are conducted with transparency and a goal of building trust and maintaining trust. So we want, you know, again, the things that we do, think about what are we doing that builds the trust? One of the principals that I worked with locally, it kind of news was getting out of the great things that were happening in that school. And so the media wanted to come in, and TV media wanted to come in and do a story. And so the principal was texting me about this, and she got permission from her central office to do an interview. But sadly, it seemed the interviewer wanted to really press her for what are the stories of trauma of the children. And this is a principal that at times would ride the bus with the students because she was looking for opportunities to build that rapport. And there was no way in the world she was going to even hint at any of the stories to this reporter, because in 2 minutes of the 6 o'clock news, she would totally undo what she had done in earning the trust and the respect of these young people. And then another thing is being authentic. It's not going to raise your program budget a dime to just be authentic. And then directly address limits to confidentiality. And most of our programs have some sort of form that people have to sign if we are going to need to share information. But all those kinds of things engender trust. All right, some other ways that we engender trust is by dignity, respect, validation, listening, being present in the moment. You know, it's so easy, you know, with cell phones and all. I think we need a support group. You know, folks, when Chick-fil-A, back when we can go back in the dining room, you know, when they have a thing that says Wednesday night, yeah, is family night, you have to put your cell phone in a basket. That's pretty sad. But, you know, I'm sometimes that way too. My husband and I'll be out doing something or eating out, and he'll be like, who are you texting, you know? And it could be my 86-year-old mother who's actually texting me right now. But the point is, you know, where technology has helped make some things convenient, it's also divided our attention. And so learn to listen when you're working with your clients and your consumers. And then these are all things that build the foundations of healing through safety and trust. Okay, number 3 is peer support. And again, because we can't really interact a lot, I don't know what offerings you may have as far as peer support, but good examples of peer support are things like AA groups, NA groups, but a sports program or a band. You know, I read studies years ago that when funding to schools was tight, many of them cut their band program, but they noticed that the band had a profound effect on young people making better grades because of this extra curriculum activity, kind of a teamwork approach, that young people were in band and learning music, that it had a more of a positive approach by having it in the school than by just dismissing it by pulling the funds out. So there can be many kinds of things that suffice to be peer support. But SAMHSA describes peer support as a flexible approach to building mutual healing relationships among equals based on these core values. Voluntary, you know, you can't really, you know, demand someone, you know, go to peer support. A lot of domestic violence programs have very successful peer support groups, and they're non-judgmental, they're respectful, they're reciprocal, and they're empathetic. And so, you know, we can see, I know at the St. Jude's Cancer Research Center affiliate over at Niswonger, that whole staff has been trauma-informed. They're just knocking it out of the park, some of the things they're doing. And they notice a lot of anger in the families, a lot of anger in the young children that are battling childhood cancer. And honestly, rightfully so. I mean, what could be more difficult than a family or a child encountering cancer? And so they were able to identify some funding and bring in a psychologist and begin to do an anger support group for these families. And apparently someone in the group shared on social media, and they started having other people inquiring how could they come and be a part of this group. So some other examples of peer support, as I mentioned, Boys and Girls Clubs, sports, mentors, band. There are many kind of youth group, you know, sometimes a workout club where people are going in and doing a cycling or an aerobics class, or all those kind of things, you know, build community and are good examples of some kind of a peer support. Okay, number 4 is collaboration and mutuality. And this is very important in the fact that though people come to us with needs, we need to find a way to deliver the resources that we have by leveling the power differences between staff and clients, even when it's kids. And it demonstrates that healing happens in relationships and meaningful sharing of power and decision making. Again, you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. To me, one of the most graphic illustrations of mutual sharing and collaboration in navigating difficult situations is a family justice center. Now, some of you on this call today may not know anything about that. I wrote the grant at the Johnson City Police Department for our family justice center that opened in 2016. And it's a model from California. And because Tennessee ranks so high as a state of the number of domestic violence, Governor Haslam, when he was in term, wanted to open 10 of those centers across the state. So we were number 7. Sullivan County has one. They were number 8. I'm not sure where all the others are. But that model, what it is it's not a shelter, but it's one location that you can go to if you're suffering domestic abuse. And there's counseling there, there's prosecutorial, there's legal aid, there's child services, all in this one-stop shop. And so when someone shows up, the first face that they meet with at the Family Justice Center is called a navigator. And that victim tells their story one time, and the navigator listens, makes the notes, and then basically the question is brought back to the victim: how can we help you today? You know, they may not be ready for filing an order of protection. They may just want, on that first or fifth visit, maybe just to help create a safety plan. When I visited the Knoxville Family Justice Center many years ago, when we were getting that program up and running here, they told a story of how AT&T in Knoxville, a lot of the phones that are turned back in, they donate a certain percentage of them to the domestic violence program there, and all they can call is the number 911, because many times when someone is in a domestic situation, the perpetrator is very manipulative, very abusive, and they're going to say things like, you know, I'm going to kill your pet, I'm going to take the car keys, break your phone. And lo and behold, in giving out these phones that can only call 911, they had a story they shared that day in Knoxville of a gal who hid that phone out in a garden. And sure enough, one day in a very heated situation, very dangerous situation, she was able to escape and get out to the yard and call that phone, use that phone to call 911, and it saved her life. And so that is a great example that the navigator allows the person to dictate how they want to navigate that situation. Now I'm going to show you a little SAMHSA video, and I'm just going to tell you up front, it's a true story. William is going to tell this story. He is now a mental health professional. He's got a wonderful story, but it's a little graphic of what happened to him, and he's going to just talk about what happened in his childhood and then how he's navigated that. But the point he's going to bring out and illustrate so beautifully is how that the counselor that he started to meet with as a child understood leveling the power differences and asked him what mattered to him. Okay.
On July 2nd, 1984, at age 10, I had witnessed my mother, Jacqueline, and 12-year-old brother, Anthony, murdered in our living room by my mom's ex-boyfriend. He took his own life that day, but not before making me beg for my life at gunpoint. When I left our family living room, I felt completely humiliated. Our family was so devastated. We had lost 2 amazing and wonderful people that day. I thought my world had ended. It didn't take long before that humiliation would surface, and at age 14, I attempted to take my own life. I was hospitalized for the first time in a psychiatric unit, finally taking some time to address what had happened to me throughout my childhood. When I was released, I was referred to outpatient therapy, and I was assigned to a therapist named Christine Pierre. From that moment I met her, I felt this sense of equality. She was judgment-free. Because I was hypervigilant and always on alert, thinking that I could be harmed, people called me crazy and a host of other negative nicknames. I was easily bullied by my peers, and I was easily victimized by others. But Miss Pierre did something that I'll never forget. She took me down to the hospital cafeteria and opened up her hand and said on that first meeting,
"What do you want for lunch?" I was mesmerized at all of the food choices, and I guess I said to this lady and to myself, "I'm going to clean you out." I went into that cafeteria and I must have built the biggest ice cream cone you can build on this side of Earth. Years later, I would come to understand that Miss Pierre erased the power differential in the relationship we had. I felt respected every week I attended their session. She didn't try to control me, but in that relationship, she moved from control to collaboration. It was a teamwork effort to support my pathway to healing. But I think the most important piece to her method was that in every session with Miss Pierre, she observed what I valued the most. She didn't pick out that food for me in that cafeteria. She just opened up the portal to understand what was important to me, and ice cream was my favorite food in the entire world. Over 25 years later, much of the work that I'm involved in focuses on values. At the Commonwealth Center for Children and Adolescents in Virginia, we're building on the work they're doing with children through a revised and co-developed personal safety assessment tool that once focused on identifying and understanding what made kids upset and how they calmed down once they were upset. While we're still interested in what makes kids upset and what triggers kids, we inserted 2 questions that they answer within the first 24 hours of admission. And those 2 questions are, what is most important to you? And what are your coping strategies? When we meet children now who are introduced or reintroduced to the system, what is important to them surfaces to the top of our agenda in treatment. And the conversation about what is important is sustained through the intervention and even in their family environment. If our values and beliefs drive our decision-making, our actions, and our behaviors, then it's important to be aware of what is important to people the moment we engage them in order to support the facilitation of healing, of rebuilding, of recovery, and resilience. Miss Pierre believed in me. She focused on what was important to me and what I valued the most. That early collaboration and feeling of mutuality with Miss Pierre to facilitate my own healing as a teenager is key in who I am today.
All right. So what a really powerful, powerful example. I mean, what a horrific trauma that William experienced. And yet what healing came to him, and it partially started through a counselor who thought to acknowledge him and ask what was important to him. Okay, number 5 is empowerment, voice, and choice. And so one of the pillars that our program needs to have to create a healing environment for trauma survivors is that the individual's strengths and experiences are recognized and built upon, and the experience of having a voice and a choice is validated. You know, again, someone that is born into life with an addicted caregiver, they don't know life any other way. You know, one of my favorite activities when I worked for police and I was overseeing development of this probation program, the first probation program of its kind in the state of Tennessee, was that when the individuals in the program reached certain milestone goals, we had what we called an incentive outing. And because I was a city employee, I was allowed to use any kind of city facility or park, that kind of thing. And we would get a local restaurant to donate a bunch of box lunches, and we'd go out to Kiwanis Park and play kickball. And it would always be the program attendees against the staff. And it was just so much fun to get out there in the sunshine, eat a box lunch, and play kickball. I don't know if the staff honestly ever won, but you know what? On that day, in that park, in that sunshine, we're just all people. And we really tried to remove us and them from our language, because we need to sometimes help people find their voice. And again, though trauma is not an excuse for drugs or crime, that it needs to be said to individuals that what happened to you at the start of your life was not your fault, but how can we help you to make some build healthier coping skills than the ones that they gravitated to without having healthy support. And so empowerment, voice, and choice are critical, and that your program, no matter what kind of service you offer today, even if you're just on here and you're thinking of your relatives or your friends or the children, your own children, you need to have a belief in resilience. I heard a minister say one time when he was a young preacher that he actually was preaching and he got so excited he fell off the stage. What a nightmare. Fell off the stage in the back, and there was a set of drums there, and he fell off the stage into the drums, and his feet are sticking up in the air while his rear end is down in the big drum, and he's thinking, there goes my message. And then he has the thought, get up. So he jumped up and jumped back to the platform and finished his sermon. And he said at the end, a woman came right up to the platform and she said, I noticed you fell off the stage. And he said, yes, I did. But did you see my comeback? And she said again, no. Do you do this often? Do you fall off often when you're preaching? He said, no, that's the first it ever happened. But did you see my comeback? And folks, oftentimes people replay and rehash the problem and the setback and everything, but why don't we start majoring on the comebacks? Why don't we start majoring in our programs on how we got up, how we picked ourselves up, how we moved ahead, how we helped individuals move ahead? And some examples are some things that can become programs that the clients, we notice their strengths, some of the activities that are designed and led by clients. In the probation program, we noticed that many of our attendees were very artistic. And so I noticed yesterday was a proclamation from the governor about Overdose Awareness Day. And when we would, I think August is Alcohol Awareness Month, September is Addiction Recovery Month, I believe, and we would have door decorating contests. And when it was time for someone to graduate the program, we would allow them to make an invitation that would go to the judge, would go to the chief of police. And I know for a fact that those judges saved every single one of those hand-drawn invitations because it was so meaningful that it came from someone in the program. And so what could you do in your program that turns some of the problems into strengths that could be used in your program? And here's an example of a group of court-involved teens in New York City is that they were discussing this with probation and parole, and they knew that they were pretty much looked upon in the communities troublemakers and not in a positive way. And so a local shop owner, as they had experienced a lot of graffiti on their shop wall, they donated their wall. And I know this to be true. There are people I know in Johnson City when I worked for the city that would allow a couple we were able to put murals on. But they let the teens come out and in a restorative act to paint a mural of how they saw their self. And it was very inspirational that in their core values, they said that empathy was important and doing things for others and showing respect, which was probably not at all how the community viewed them. Okay, and then lastly on this, and then we're going to talk some more about some strategies, is that SAMHSA said that we need to always respect a cultural, historical, and gender approach. And more now than ever, we need to be so careful that we don't use stereotypes or biases, and that we are always very intentional that our programming is done with equity and diversity and treats all people valuable and human, regardless of the cultural or historical differences, or even of sometimes some of the criminal behavior there's a video that I don't have in this training, but it's from a new national group called the Compassion Prison Project. And I actually have a call with them tomorrow. They want to talk about collaborating, and they have a video. It's called Step Inside the Circle. And back in February, they went into a men's prison in Los Angeles, and they've been working with the inmates there, talking about your life and how trauma in the early part of your life without healthy support can lead to unhealthy behaviors, which is largely addiction. And folks, once someone gets into addiction, there's not going to be much time before criminal behavior is going to come along, because you're going to have to generally engage in that to support addiction. But the lady, Fritz, that leads the group that day, she has a big bullhorn, and she has all the inmates circled up out in the yard, and she begins to read through a list of questions. It's very powerful. And she says, if you were mistreated as a child or kicked or bruised or whatever, step inside the circle. If you're had an addicted caregiver, step inside the circle. And before the end of the little activity, almost every single inmate has moved inside the circle, inside the circle, inside the circle. And so what they're doing is raising the value of human life, regardless of your situation. And so we need to be so careful that our messaging, that we have a lens of equity and diversity, that no one feels excluded from our services based on their gender, based on their ethnicity, based on their religion, that our services are welcome and open to all. And a couple examples, there's a women's prison in Hawaii, and they have an island custom. I don't know how to pronounce the Hawaiian word, but because Hawaii is made up of islands, where in our area we could be watching for tornado warnings, well, they could have tsunami warnings, and they have a highest place on each island that is a place of refuge that people know to travel to if there is a tsunami warning. So what they did was started to paint some of the women's cells and some of the common areas in this prison to reflect what the women could remember, that the place on their island that looks like this refuge, what it symbolized. And they began to paint some of these things around the inside of the prison walls. And then also in some of the inner cities, they found that sometimes that individuals were not accessing health services. So they listed leaders of color and some of the imams in the mosques who turned, if you think about it, most houses of faith are empty all week long. They may have a service on the weekend or a midweek service, but oftentimes these are fully furnished facilities, heated in the winter, cold in the summer. And so they begin to use these inner city houses of faith to deliver more health services. And we could give more examples, but so trauma-informed services are focused on understanding the whole person and the context of their whole life when we're treating them. And we understand the role that violence and victimization may play. And we always want to deliver services in a non-shaming, non-blaming way, and minimize the possibilities of victimization or re-traumatizing someone. And they're designed to facilitate recovery, growth, and healing, and hospitable and engaging. And so kind of here's again an approach where the ACEs pyramid goes in one direction. Here's my pyramid that I've developed in my trainings on a framework for healing. And I know from working for a large healthcare system that by and large in the past, when we've talked about trauma survivors, the only kind of service that's been really recognized has been the bottom one here, a clear access to clinical and behavioral health resources, which I think all of us would admit we know there's a shortage of. But now we know in understanding trauma-informed care that there are other layers that can bring about healing to a trauma survivor. Back to my point about the bus driver. Also, there's a best-selling author. His name is Steve Pemberton. He was in foster care for 11 years as a child. I think longer than that, but 11 of those years was in a foster care home that was not a good home, was not a good situation. He was violated in that home. but he loved to read. And the only book, he could only find one book in the home, and he would sit out on the porch and read. And a neighbor that would pass by frequently saw this little kid sitting out on the porch reading. And she noticed that the more she passed the house, the child was always reading the same book. So without coming in and asking any questions or whatever, mysteriously over time, boxes of used books started showing up on the porch. And later, as Steve grew up and all, he found out it was the neighbor that had done this. But see, look at that charging station in the community, like the bus driver. Look at the healing impact that just having a trauma-informed approach can do, bring about healing. So the top part of the funnel, or the top part of the pyramid, is that a lot of healing can take place through a trauma-informed approach when it becomes the norm at every level of our services. And we're that way with our team members, where there's not the judging and the blaming and the shaming, and we're having the mindset that sometimes some of our team members, that they may be having a backstory of trauma. And so we have a trauma-informed approach to everything we do, scheduling appointments, to all the types of levels of our services are done with a trauma-informed approach. And then the middle layer is what I call warm hand-holding or mentoring or case management. And so, you know, if you are involved, and if you someone that is a trauma survivor, oftentimes, again, back to the prison program, it's hard to remember, keep the dates or calendars and things like that. And so that's why sometimes the extra layer of case management, married and with a family, my boys are grown and married now, but, to file an insurance claim, or we had some pipes break many years ago. I was actually in the hospital having had an emergency appendectomy. And the night while I'm in the hospital, my husband came home to a flooded basement. And so I was so upset the next day because nobody came back to see me. And I was so mad when he got back. I was like, what kind of family is this? And then I felt terrible that I run him over the coals, and he was telling me what a mess the house was in. But in filing those papers and processes, you need a manager in your family. So imagine being a single parent, and navigating a job or maybe two jobs to keep a roof over the head of your children and to keep up with the schoolwork. Honestly, I can't even imagine now where so many kids have had to shift to home. And so many times, just the additional layer of case management and mentoring is going to bring healing to trauma survivors. And then lastly, and important, are the clinical interventions. But I feel, and you'll notice the size of these interventions shrinks, because I feel like if we have more trauma-informed communities, more trauma-informed and resilient programming, more mentoring opportunities, and then I think we're going to see over time that's going to minimize the layers of trauma, of actual behavioral services that will be needed. So to make a difference in someone's life, you don't have to be brilliant, rich, beautiful, or perfect. You just have to care. Okay, so let's wrap up our last few minutes here by doing a deeper dive into our protective factors, okay? So as a refresher, protective factors or resilience factors are conditions or attributes in individuals, families, and communities that help people deal more effectively with stressful or traumatic events, okay? So 3 things that we're going to focus on in the remainder of our time today. Number 1 is having concrete support that can lessen or eliminate the risk of long-term effects from trauma. Number 2, self-regulation skills. And number 3 are problem-solving skills. All right, so let's talk about relationships. So since healthy relationships help mitigate the effects of trauma, then to individuals that are in unhealthy relationships, a child, again, that is spoken disparagingly of, is criticized by their caregiver, they're not going to stop loving the caregiver. They're going to stop loving themselves. And so many times people have not had anything to compare relationships to know that some of the relationships that they're exposed to are not healthy. So when we want to look at our protective factors, we need to make sure that individuals understand what healthy relationships look like, okay? So here's just a quick little checklist. Do you feel good about yourself when you are around the other person? So this is kind of a guideline of who can qualify in being in our protective factors that as far as relationships, okay? And number two is you don't want to try to control each other in a healthy relationship, that there's an equal amount of give and take. You know, I have a couple of girlfriends that are honestly 30 and 40-year friends, that are three of them that have gone to church with me all that time. And honestly, when I've been in the toughest places in life, I'll never forget about 18, 20 years ago, I came into a real difficult situation that I honestly didn't know what I was going to do. It just came about very, very suddenly, very unexpectedly. And I remember having coffee with a friend, one of these friends, and I had been crying for a couple of days. I was just so taken aback by this situation. And she said to me over coffee, she said, "Okay, enough crying." She said, "That isn't going to fix it." And, you know, at first that was a little hard to hear, but it was what I needed to hear, because, you know, I could have continued to cry about that for a long, long time, but she was right. It wasn't making any amount of a change. And then many years later, she found herself in a situation. And so our friendship is an amount of give and take. And then number three is you need to feel safe, and that this individual is trustworthy to share things that are important to you, and that they're confidential, that they keep a confidence. You know, I feel like sometimes that's almost a lost gift, is people that you can trust to keep your confidence, and that you like to spend time together, but you're also comfortable being apart, and you can be yourself with them. You know, honestly, I'm not too good being around folks that I can't be myself with. I do help with youth group at church, and I wasn't cool when I was 16. I'm definitely not cool now at almost 62. But you know what? Those kids know that I love them, and I'll get a random text, or one of them want to put me as a reference on a job application, because, you know, as corny as I may be, act like their grandmother, have all my verbiage is totally out of date and everything, you know what? I'm myself around them. And that you respect each other's opinions and disagree, and most importantly, there's no fear in the relationship. And so you might need to review, as you begin to integrate with your clients, the importance of having healthy relationships. You might need to review to them what healthy relationships look like. Okay, then on the flip side, what unhealthy relationships look like. Well, when you spend time with this person, you feel sad, angry, scared, or worried, or you feel controlled, and that you give more attention than they give back to you, that you cannot openly share or feel like you can trust them. And, you know, folks, we all know that if we ask, we could all come up with some names of people maybe that we work with or serve in our clientele, our consumers, that this may be the large percentage of their family relationships. I was working with a school one time, and a principal texted me, and they had a teenager whose mother was an addict. And so the young person was going to fail school because the parent would not get the child to school. And so she said the child does very well when they come to school, but they're going to fail within a few days. I'll have to put them out because the caregiver will not get them to school. And she said, could I find maybe someone to donate a bicycle? And so I texted around some folks that I knew had connections to bikes. And lo and behold, I got a young man who said, yeah, I'll give a bike. Well, this man did not give a used, broken down, bent up bike. He gave a very nice mountain bike. And when he showed me a picture, I said, you know what? Why don't you go to the school? And I told him where it was, and meet with the principal and give this young person this bike. You know, you're so generous here. You should have the reward of seeing this child's excitement at your generosity. So they said, okay. So they went and brought the bike, and later texted me a picture of the principal, them, the bike, the kid. Okay, well, about 3 hours later, this person that donated the bike texted me and said, you aren't going to believe this. He said, I just saw the bike just went by my house, and the person riding it is not the kid. what had happened was the kid told their parent about the bike, the gift of the bike. The parent came to the school, stole the bike, and now was on their way to hawk the bikes for the next fix of drugs. You know, professionals, when that is your support system, how are you going to thrive? How are you going to do well in school? And so when we're defining unhealthy relationships, some individuals, because we don't pick where we start in life, may be growing up in a home where this describes the situation. And that's why through our caseworkers, through our DCS, through our school teachers, through our boys club, through our park and rec, through our police, through our healthcare, that's why we're interjecting all kind of resiliency into our community, kind of like rescuing people from a burning building. You know, if I can't get up to that floor, then I'm going to have trained 50 others that are going to be able to interact and get up there and rescue that person. Okay. And so another thing that defines unhealthy relationships is you feel pressure to spend more time together and guilt when apart. Matter of fact, a common sign of a perpetrator of domestic violence is they begin to cut the victim off from all outside relationships. And that's a number one trait when all of a sudden now the victim can no longer see family, they can't go shopping with friends. That's generally a big red flag that there could be some kind of manipulation going on. Or when you have to be someone you're not, when you're in this relationship, you don't feel respected, you cannot disagree. And again, you feel fear. So let's do a little support system inventory, okay? So here's some things that we want to ask those that we work with and ourselves. Belonging. Do I have people in my life I can trust? Belonging. Do I have people who show respect for my beliefs and the way that I live my life? Safety. People that say that my responses in stressful situations are helpful to my relationships with families and others. And do I feel safe at home? Do I feel safe in my community? And on a regular basis, I have my social emotional support that I need. You know, so these are some things that we need to ask ourselves, and we need to help those that we serve identify, do we have a healthy support system? And so here's an activity that you can do with people you serve on naming your support system. So when I trained the Elizabethan school system last year, one day administrators asked me if I would go and talk to all the parents on a parent night at one of the elementary schools. And since I only had 30 minutes, I didn't really feel like I should try to do a tremendous depth of ACEs, but I talked all about protective factors. So I pre-planned with the principal and the teachers that when the parents were in the assembly, I would talk about strengthening connection. And then when they visited the child's classroom, that each teacher would have a little activity for the parents to do to talk about what is my support system. So we had them name at least 3 people that you know you could count on. You know, I'm sure most of us that are on this today, maybe we have dozens of friends, but in that dozen of friends, who would you call, you know, if your car is broken down on the highway, you know, in the middle of the night, or, you know, something like that. That kind of, you know, shifts it up a bit about, you know, maybe the friends. And even though I grew up here from high school on, I'm a transplant. I came from New Orleans and Miami. And so I never had grandparents here, never had cousins here. And so a lot of my core friends have been developed around my faith through church connection and all. And so you want to make sure that you know of at least, you know, 3 or 4 people that are always going to be there for you. And another thing about support system is your support system is going to change over life. Some of the people that I adopted as grandparents are now deceased, or maybe in a assisted living where, you know, we don't have that access. And then in that activity we did that night in that school is name 3 people that would name you as a support of your support system. So we want people in strengthening their connection to see that it goes both ways, that not only do I need a protective factor of support system, but then how can I turn around and be that to others. So if you are in a staff position, if you're a teacher, if you're a preschool, if you're a Boys and Girls Club, if you're over staff that work with a group of children, here's what's called the connection assignment. And I would suggest you do it at a Nest staff meeting, to bring a picture or a drawing or something, some article, even if it's a Post-it note with each of the children's names or each of the clients' names maybe that you serve, drawing that represents each of the children, and to a meeting, and with the child's name on it, and hang these all around the wall in a meeting room, and then ask everyone to walk around the room and to place a check mark or a sticker beside every child or young person that they have some connection to. Maybe they made a connection in the bus line and they know their name, and they know every day that their grandpa is going to pick them up. They just know that little thing about them, and maybe they know their grandpa from the farmer's market or whatever, but they have a connection. But more importantly is at the conclusion of this activity, now identify the children that are in your program that are left out, that don't have a connection, that no one related and said, I connect to that child in some way. And now we need to be intentional that we want to draw these people in and assign them maybe to someone that they're going to begin to have a short check-in, a wave, a greeting, something intentional that is going to connect. Because folks, connection is the cure. Really, for trauma-informed care. You know, I read a book last summer written by some doctors from the Cooper Institute, and they did research on the effects of compassion in healthcare. And one thing they found over a systematic review of 1,000 research studies on compassion, connection, empathy in healthcare, they found that two things: that it helped patients to heal, and it also prevented provider burnout when there's more compassion in healthcare. And one of the chapters in their book talked about suicide, and in the discovery of the studies about loneliness and compassion and those that tragically ended their life by suicide, they had access to some notes that were left by folks that had committed suicide. And one of the notes they shared in the book, which I almost every training I do, I include it, because no matter what your role is, oh, now I have a neighbor mowing. So the fun of home Zoom meetings. Okay, sorry about the mowing, but one of the things, and I include this in all of my trainings, so no matter what your role is today, you could be the person that this person described in the note. So before this person tragically ended their life jumping off a bridge, they wrote a note, and in their note they said, if on the way to the bridge tonight, one person smiles at me, I won't jump. Now, professionals, whatever it is your role is that brought you to this training today, you know, I want to challenge you. Who would of us would not have brought a smile to the workplace, or a smile to the benches of the ball game we're going to watch, or a smile when we walk around the neighborhood, if we had any idea that someone that we passed had put that in a note, that contemplating ending their life? And so connection is so critical. And that's why in my funnel, I have that as the top and the largest layer, connection. Okay, so now we're going to talk about self-regulation. So the process child development experts tell us the way that a child develops self-regulation is a process, okay? And I want you to realize that whether you're working with adults, whether you're working with youth, that you need to, it'd be good to print this slide out and put it somewhere, because every single person you work with, even including ourselves, we are somewhere along the way in this continuum. Hopefully we're in the self-regulation part, okay? But the way a child learns regulation, it begins, and somebody I noticed in the chat mentioned TBIR, and TBIR has some great trust-based relational interventions. For several months this year, Texas Christian University offered this wonderful course, several courses, a couple of them that you could take for free. I don't know what they cost now, but they were only free to August 31st. But Dr. Karen Purvis, who developed a lot of those materials, she gives some really good information on regulation and a child's voice. So it'd even be worth the cost of the course if you're someone that works with children. But in that, she does talk about some things with regulation. And so regulation in our life begins by external. So my grandchildren, my little grandson the other day, he's 2 years old. He just gets so excited and just charges into life. And he fell down, and I'm right there. You know, I almost could have caught him, but he tripped and fell, but he's crying, and I gathered him in my arms and just held him tightly while he's crying a minute, just rubbed his head and told him everything's going to be okay. You know, so he's getting regulated by an external source. But go back quickly in your mind through everything we've covered in this training and how many children are growing up and they're not getting any external regulation. And folks, on this paradigm, on this process, on this shift, that is where regulation begins, is having some external way. So now we may find ourselves in an alternative high school working with teenagers that have no sense of regulation. And that's because they never were allowed, they never started this process. They never had an adult modeling it. They never had an adult giving them that external regulation in the earliest years of life. So you know what we're going to have to do in our alternative high school? We're going to have to begin with them and help them create some sort of setting in our school, a calming room or a peace corner or something that helps to de-escalate this child. And largely we're going to have to start them on the continuum by showing them how to regulate, largely by some external resources, okay? Now, when we get enough of that, they're going to move to a stage of co-regulation, where now a child learns. So now, you know, when my grandson was an infant, he would just cry and cry and cry, and I wouldn't know if it meant a poopy diaper, or he had his tummy was not reacting to food, or he was hungry or tired. And when my boys were little, I'll never forget what a sense of relief when they were able to ask for a drink or ask for, even if it was, you know, in a funny language that only I could understand. But what's happening now? Now we're partnering. Now we're doing this together, okay? We're co-regulating. And so now a child learns to identify the needs and ask for help. And they're watching and they're learning from caregivers. And so, you know, when I begin to do trauma-informed training for teachers, you know, I tell the teachers where teachers just kind of feel so overwhelmed, you know, with things, and even before COVID, you know, please, not something else I have to learn. But see, when you make the investment up front to begin to get this trauma-informed lens on, and then you begin to practice some of these things, I've never met an educator or a preschool person, worker, that would have ever said, I want to go back to do things before being trauma informed. And so some of this regulation now has to move to the classroom or the Boys and Girls Club or the sports program, because it's not been happening at home. Kids are not seeing the regulation. So we move from external regulation to co-regulation, then to self-regulation. And depending on the age of the child, the caregiver may still be in charge and needed. But now my granddaughter, who's 4, if she comes over and we're watching a movie or something and she gets cold, she knows where Namie has all the blankets, and she'll jump up and go get a quilt and bring it over, you know, because what is she doing? She's learning to self-regulate. So folks, as we help people around us build these self-regulation skills, it may be a single mom that's coming in our program and we're helping her to get into housing or find some job skill training or help her write a resume. And you know, and she just is, you know, coming unglued at the smallest little thing. Well, then maybe what we see is where she's at in this continuum. What can we do in our programming that's going to help this cycle for her, that we can provide assurance, that we can have a safety in our program and begin to have some of these external things? And then what are we going to do now to move her up the continuum to co-regulate? And so they begin to partner in this and use their voice to ask for help and to explain some of the needs, where eventually they're going to get to the place of self-regulation, okay? So for children, here's some regulation strategies. Magic mustache. If you were to take your finger, if you can see me now on the screen, and bend your knuckle and put it under your nose and the little dip there over your lip, actually that's a pressure point. And if you hold it there and breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, and do that about 4 or 5 times, you're going to notice it has a tremendous calming effect on you. So you can do magic mustache with kids. Now, if they're older, like last week when I was training police, I did not call it magic mustache. I called it tactical breathing. So it's all in the way you present it. But the International Chiefs Association recommends officers know about the importance of deep breathing and how it can de-escalate people on a scene. Or here's an example of an engine plate. You can get a whole bunch of paper plates and put a little brass tack in it and have an arrow and just show, what am I running on? Am I blue? Am I green? Am I red? I visited a girls' juvenile detention center in the state of Maryland a couple years ago, because Maryland was working to become trauma informed in their juvenile program. And one of the guards there showed me in the cafeteria where they had come up with something in a similar fashion. And they had like a United Way, those big thermometers you drive around town, and it'll show where we're at and meeting our funding goal. Well, they had in the cafeteria a big thermometer with different colors. And when a girl would come in the morning to get her breakfast, she had her name on a strip of Velcro, and she was to go over to the thermometer and indicate to the staff how was her engine running. And so staff knew that if her engine was running red, that maybe we needed to, somebody spend a minute and talk to them. And maybe today's the birthday of someone and they know they're not going to get to see them, or maybe it's their birthday, and the things that would cause their engine to be running red. And actually the guard that showed that to me that day and explained it, she mentioned one of the girls' names that was red, and here it was in the afternoon when I was there, and she said, you know what? She told me that at lunch she's going to move her name up into green. And so what are they doing? They're teaching regulation, and there's a million of ways that we can apply this. It's little things, sensory, like wall push-ups. When I was training healthcare workers, oftentimes because of caseloads and short staff, they don't take breaks often. And I taught them how to have a 90-second vacation. Did you know that 80% of the stimulus to you comes through your eyes? And just like the activity that Shannon led, if you just close your eyes almost immediately, unless don't be driving when you do this, and that's a terrible joke, but closing your eyes, it just causes a great amount of calm. Why? Because you're lowering the amount of stimulus that's coming in. And then a singing bowl. One day my husband said, what did we just get from Amazon that came from Tibet? And I had ordered a little singing bowl, which is a little brass bowl that monks tap out the sides, and they actually use them in Tibet to call the monks to prayer. And it's kind of like a wind chime. And one principal got one of these, and she said, if the building was on fire, the only thing I'd want to run back and get is my singing bowl. Because when students come in now and they're escalated in their emotions, and they tap this little brass bowl and they begin to move this little pedestal around, it starts to sing. And if you close your eyes and then listen to the chime all the way till it ends, then someone is regulated. And then exercise, it's back like me and my bike riding, or people that, get in and exercise. There's a certain amount of regulation that happens, or music. Many people are regulated by music. So look at this illustration, and we'll kind of, we're getting near wrapping it up here, but think about how the brain works. So when you see someone that's in the de-escalated state where they're in fight, flight, or freeze, then there's 3 messages that you're going to have to do. So think of it as, say if you're rescuing someone that's drowning, okay? How are you going to latch a hold of them? How are you going to pull them to you? And then how are you going to pull them ashore? So think about this when you want to work someone up through the brain, okay? So when you see someone in a de-escalated state, immediately your message needs to communicate, you are safe, okay? So that's how you're going to connect to someone who's in a dysregulated state, to communicate, you are safe. And then the middle section, the limbic system, the emotional state, you need to communicate, I'm here with you. And then we are going to move up then to the executive state. Now we can find a solution. Folks, we're not going to be able to just jump right in and find that solution unless we start at the level of you are safe, then I am here. Now we can find a solution. So problem solving skills, we're about done here. So we want to make sure that when we go to building problem solving skills that we are regulated emotionally. Why? Because in our fight, flight, or freeze, we're not going to be able to do critical thinking and the things that we need for problem solving. We need to learn to listen and to think calmly, consider options, and some options might involve compromises, create an action plan, and practice the plan. So for instance, I know sometimes, a friend of mine had a foster child, and because the foster child once in a blue moon had contact with their biological parent, and often it was very upsetting when that little child would be returned to the foster home. And so what are ways now that we know that that child is going to have that visit, and in the long run, that could be very, very a good thing for that child to maintain that important connection to that biological parent. If then on their end, they're doing the things that DCS or protective services are requiring of them. But we know that that's going to have an unsettling effect to that child. So what could be our action plan? And then practicing that plan. For many years, I was involved with Weight Watchers. I fell off the wagon a while back, but we would think about having our carrot sticks and our celery, or what's going to be your go-to food when you feel the munchies kind of come on. So you would have the action plan and practice it, okay? All right, then lastly here, some healing gestures. This actually comes, there's a citation at the bottom from the CHAD video. In the bottom of the video, it did reference healing gestures. So we got a couple of gestures here. One of them is celebrate. There's just not enough celebrating. And I know now it's particularly challenging with COVID, but just a smile, a cheer. I think with masks on, one thing nice about webinars is I can wear lipstick. But when I'm in the grocery store, often I'll tell a clerk, I say, I'm smiling at you under here, because, it's not as easy to see. Vanderbilt Children's Hospital did a program called the Button Project, that they noticed that all their healthcare team that interacted with children, the children only saw them from this way up. So what they did was very inexpensively got these big buttons made they wore on their uniform, and the child immediately could see the caregiver's face. So I was telling some schools the other day when I was training, and the daycare, the child care folks in Mississippi, about the Button Project. So it's just a simple thing as a smile, a kind word, a greeting, to celebrate. Okay, and then comforting, just to be able to consistently provide some support is a buffer to those that are experiencing stress. And listening, to listen is a gesture we practice every day. The difference between hearing and listening is giving your attention. And I love this little quote that says, if you don't listen eagerly to the little stuff when they're little, they won't tell you the big stuff when they're big, because to them, all of it was big stuff all along. Okay, the fourth one is collaborate. We've already touched on that, but find ways to help kids, set kids up to succeed. Maybe you have a student that does good in art, does good in sports. Well, set them up to shine. Many times kids are coming to us. I had coffee a few years ago with a young man who's on a scholarship to a local college for his giftedness in athletics, and he'd never had a parent come to a game, he was only in college now because of the care of coaches along the way. And so, what we may take for granted as the people in our lives that cheer us on, there are many people around us that are trauma survivors that don't have that. And then inspire. We might not feel all that inspiring, but to some young person or some person that is about to throw in the towel, our words can mean more than we would ever know. All right, so there's some of the resources where everything came from, and there's my contact information, and we're done a few minutes early. I don't know if Shannon, you want to see if there's a couple of questions, or we'll just wrap it up early. But I really thank everybody that's attended and stayed for the whole event. And I hope you found that some of the things we shared were helpful.
If I can just very quickly say, if you would like a certificate for this training, if you will please put your email and the name you would like on a certificate in the chat box, I will get those out to you within a week or so. Does anyone have questions for Becky?
I would like to know if the recording would be given to the to us, or is it okay for us to share with I have a group of volunteers that I think will be very helpful to them. Is it okay for me to share the slides or the recording to my volunteers? Thank you.
Well, okay, Jillian, I'll leave that to Jillian. My slides are copyrighted, and so Jillian, you know, has brought me on as a trainer and a consultant. So if she is good with that, I don't mind them sharing with you. But now I did allow her to record this so that she can use this training over and over. I'll just let Jillian kind of answer that question.
I'm fine with that. The more people we can get this message out to, the better.
Okay.
So I am totally fine with that. It may take me, if you need this training before you hear from me, please reach back out to me. It'll take me a little bit of time to get it pretty and into a shareable form, but I'm happy to share it with you for your volunteers. So just reach.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other questions for Becky before we end? Tiffany has a question. You can unmute yourself if you want to, or put it in the chat box, either one.
Speaking, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I did want to clarify that you are sending out the recording in the slide, in this PowerPoint slide as well?
I would prefer not to send the recording out to the whole world.
Oh, no, I mean just to the participants on the training.
If you would like the recording, if you'll just shoot me a message and let me know kind of what you're doing with it, I'm happy to share it. We just want to.
Oh, okay, I don't necessarily want the recording. I was just clarifying what you were sending out. Is it the recording or is it a PowerPoint?
I will send out a certificate that you attended this training if you would like a certificate.
Oh, okay, because the last question was, are we going to be sent a copy of this presentation to share? And I thought the answer was yes. I was just clarifying.
I can send the presentation if you would like it, but I am not intending to send the presentation to everyone who's on this training.
Great, thank you so much. And what's the best way to get in contact with you?
I will put my email in the chat box. You can also respond to Eventbrite or any of those things. My email's on there too.
And one thing I'd like to add, since I now am independent and doing some national work, there's a little bit of a void of some training. I trained hundreds, thousands of people, but I'm working with the ETSU Ballad Health Strong Brain Institute, and one arm that I'm working with as a consultant is developing some trainings just like the one you took today, that ETSU that we're going to be offering through the Strong Brain Institute. I would love to say hopefully by spring that you can earn CEUs for, that I would think are going to be very, very affordable, and we're going to try to have them and for healthcare, for educators over time. But the first one that we already are working on is a kind of a trauma 101. And there are some other organizations that I'm kind of working with locally to try to, get some training, more and more training going on. Appreciate Jillian, doing this, a second one this summer. And then I would encourage you to join, it's not really social media, but it's a global online learning initiative called ACES Connection. And if you go in ACES Connection and you create an account for yourself, and you can check the box of all the areas you want to learn about, and don't check too many boxes because you're going to get a lot of stuff that's going to come. But if you want to know about juvenile justice, DCS, whatever your setting, you're going to find out in this international learning collaborative what people are doing. And right now, when I started, I don't think there was 7,000 or 8,000 people, and now it's over 40,000 people. And that is a super good way to continue your learning on this topic.
I hope this is okay for me to mention, I heard today also that you were doing a training specific to law enforcement. And so I just had a question from somebody about courthouses and fire stations. And so that might actually be a good fit if you have info already about that training, or would be okay to share it.
Well, that is going to be through the state Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. I'm doing a training for them, my law enforcement training, which is certified in the state of Tennessee for law enforcement. And then I'm going to do another training for them, which is going to be similar to the first portion of today's training, the SAMHSA key principles of trauma-informed approach. But I told them, they said that they're going to offer it statewide, and I don't know, 400 or 500 people. I'm not sure how many people that they can have, but they're going to give me about 2 weeks when they see if it's not filled up, and then I'm going to share it. And so if you could remind me, Jillian, the officer one is supposed to be October 9th, and that'll be a free training. But they said typically they get about 400 or 500 people statewide. And so I want to share it if they have any openings, and we'd be happy for anyone to jump in. But I'm just respecting, and I don't have the link yet, but once they get it ready and they share it, they're going to give me a couple weeks out and we'll make it known. I'll give it to Jillian and she can share it and you can jump in.
Perfect. Any other questions before we jump off? So let me clarify, Becky, you will send the presentation or not send the presentation?
Now I'm going to send you the slides because we kind of have a contract, so to speak. And then since, I did this for you, I don't know if you're going to use it for a continual orientation, and then I'll just leave that with you. Okay. So if you want to give them out, typically in a training, people end up getting the slides, but that's why I said I'm going to leave that to you.
Sure. Okay, I'm good with that. I was thinking I want to be mindful of Becky's time as well. And so if you all hear me being protective of, of her information, it's because I want to get it out to the whole world, but I also always want Becky to be compensated and to be recognized for this amazing work that she does. So I will send slides out when she sends them to me. And I'll also do this disclaimer of please don't edit them or keep the fidelity of the training. So I will send that out. I will send a certificate to everybody who has put their email in the box, and just really appreciate everybody being here and hope that you have some valuable info to take back to your folks you work with. So.
And thank you, Jillian, again for the invite. And if, if you represent an organization and you feel like they would want some training, you can always contact me at becky@beckyhaas.com. And, maybe I can help meet a training need. But like Jillian said, our heart is really to help you to make a bigger impact. So we're happy for you to, to have the slides and take what you've learned and put it to work. I love to in these trainings by saying, tag, you're it. And I'm sure Jillian has
Thank you.
a ball game to go to.
That's right. Always. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.